your old pal, the Crypt Keeper. And you are now tuned in to my good fiends at Talks from the Crypt, the most gruesome podcast in the world.
I only see like the first Halloween, the first Scream. I never see the follow-ups. There's probably like 5 of them for each, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you into horror movies much or no?
I'm into like old suspense movies.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm looking at The Omen there. I used to love The Omen.
Right. Did you watch The First Omen that just came out? Great movie.
Oh, you mean a new one?
Yeah.
No, in fact, I think I remember hearing about it. I didn't even know it had come out yet. It's good. I should throw out my gum, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, it was a fantastic movie. Usually when they're remaking movies that came out, in the 70s and they're repurposing them, they typically suck. But I thought The First Omen was great. If you haven't seen it yet, you definitely should.
So that's what it's called, The First Omen.
Yeah.
And Lee Daniels has a new horror movie on Netflix. Do you know the black guy that directed like Precious and some other movies? It came out a few weeks ago. He went to high school with me. And I don't know if it's any good. It came out a couple weeks ago, but he's a big deal. He's won Oscars for people. I forget what it's called, but it's about possession. I think it might involve an exorcism at the end.
Yeah.
And I just saw a review for they just made a prequel to Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah, I heard.
With that actress from
Ozark.
Got a pretty bad review today.
Yeah, which
the preview looked good.
Yeah. I thought it looked interesting.
Yeah.
They're remaking something else. I think they're doing another Salem's Lot as well.
Well, this isn't a remake. This is, if you remember Rosemary's Baby, it begins with Rosemary, or in the beginning, they come upon a suicide right outside the Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the story of that actress that struggling actress who killed herself and sets into motion the Rosemary Baby story.
Yeah. Do you want to make a drink? I'm going to
throw
this ice down.
Well, cheers.
Cheers, my friend.
And is that chewing tobacco?
Yeah, it's little nicotine pouches. Mm-hmm. Keeps me going. This is like maybe the 4th episode I started with a cheers on. I think it's a good tradition now.
How many cameras? Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I just upgraded. I used to have one camera, and then I used to fake it. It would be that camera right there, and then I would just zoom in on the guest or me whenever we were speaking. And, I don't know. I felt like everybody when I started the show told me that, like, you shouldn't be spending this much money on a studio. It's all in the content. You don't have to put this much thought into it. And I thought, well, if that's what most people go into it thinking, I don't want to do that then.
Yeah.
But, no, this is kind of a straight up
haters?
passion project. Surprisingly, not so many. Every now and again, people will, comment, shitty things. Like, I called Manson a serial killer a couple of times.
Oh, they don't like that.
They don't like it at all. But I just clump them into the whole category.
Yeah, fine. I've probably made the mistake myself and called him a serial killer.
Right. Well, when you're thinking about the Mount Rushmore of famous killers in the United States, he's up there for sure. Mm-hmm. So it's hard not to miscategorize him. But I mean, when you look at all of the murders, because so many people just think the Tates and then the LaBiancas. But there was a few more that were confirmed, and then there was a shit ton more that just weren't confirmed.
Right. Yeah. I just had to do a correction because Bobby Beausoleil is in Errol's film, and he says on camera to Errol or on audio that, Charlie never killed anybody. And I'm like, no, he was convicted of murdering Shorty Shea, being one of the people that stabbed them to death. He was an accessory to the Hinman murder, and he tied up the LaBiancas, so that's an accessory. He killed people. But yeah, a lot of people think he didn't kill anyone, but he did.
Well, how much closer to murdering can you get than what he already did?
Yeah.
Wasn't Shorty Shea beheaded?
That was a rumor. That's what Clem Grogan and some of the girls told people, probably to frighten them. But when they finally found his body 7 or 8 years later, I think the head actually was off the body, but they were able to determine that was animals.
Oh, geez.
Because I think the stem and the skull, I can't remember exactly, but he wasn't beheaded, yeah.
Interesting. Wow. And it took him years to dig up his body.
Well, it was only because Grogan finally told them where he hid it, where
Yeah.
he and the girls hid it in order to get paroled.
But didn't they go to excavate the land quite like a couple of times?
Oh, yeah, they went looking for him a lot. And it wasn't until, I think, 78 or 79. And they snuck Grogan out of prison in the middle of the night to have him lead him to exactly where he had left Shay. And I don't think he buried him. He just kind of covered him with leaves and rocks and dirt. And he was pretty close to where he'd been left.
Yeah, that's crazy. There's so much mystery within mysteries within mysteries when it comes to this whole helter-skelter story and what happened with Charles Manson. But I think something that I want to get into first, mainly because it's where most people get hung up on when we talk about the subject, is mind control. Now, your book is named Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. And, it kind of unravels throughout the entire book in terms of what the latter means. But I think, for me, I've mentioned the concept of mind control to people before, and I've been met with fiery anger.
Yeah. Well, here's a little secret. I didn't want the CIA in the title. I thought it was overselling because I didn't think I found enough proof that there was a connection. And the publisher persuaded me to keep it in. And I'm still not sure it works in there. But I can live with it because I do spend, quite a bit of time talking about MK Ultra and talking about what Jolly West did for them. But yeah, in England, actually, the British version of the book is just called, I think, Manson, The Untold Story or something. So it's not in there. But yeah, the MK Ultra thing. Now it's interesting. I'm not going to pat myself on the back and say it's because of my book, but there seems to be a resurgence in interest in it from when it was first disclosed in the mid-70s. There was a lot of interest then. I never understood why there wasn't more investigated about it and done about it. And that was really frustrating for me because when I began in 97 or 99, not having any idea that I would end up down that particular rabbit hole among the many, I'd never heard of MK Ultra. I didn't know what it was. And, it was a learning process for me. And at first, probably the reaction you're talking about when people say mind control or brainwashing, they think, oh, some kind of crazy conspiracy stuff, but it existed. The United States government spent a lot of money trying to develop it. And first, it was a defensive program because they thought that the Chinese and the Russians had developed the technique to basically create mind-controlled assassins, to plant false memories, all that kind of stuff. And when it began, and I have the detailed history in the book, when they discovered that the Russians and Chinese were doing that during the Korean War, that's when Alan Dulles and Richard Helms and Sidney Gottlieb kind of started a counter program about 1949 that really kind of blossomed in the early 50s. It began in a couple different acronyms, Bluebird and Monarch and some other stuff. Artichoke, yeah.
Did they all have different purposes? Like I believe Bluebird was for brainwashing and deprogramming. Artichoke was a truth serum?
Yeah, that was, but it all kind of ended up they wanted to do everything.
Yeah.
And once they started calling it MK Ultra, that kind of stuck, and that was like 52 or 53. But they said that, who knows what's true from what they admitted to later, but they said they began it as a defensive program to prevent our captured airmen who were overseas, who get shot down in planes or soldiers fighting in the Korean War from being brainwashed by the enemy. They wanted to know how to keep that from happening. And when they learned out that it was actually a pretty powerful, weapon to have in your arsenal, it became an offensive program and said, we do believe this stuff works. Why don't we do it too? So as far as me and my experience researching it, it was like it's like going to college to study psychology and pharmaceuticals and science, all the stuff I was horrible in high school and whatnot. But to understand how chemicals work and how coercion works, and most importantly, you know, what the government admitted to and what was exposed by the first journalist who found out about it, you know, and the few whistleblowers who kind of tipped them off. The first being John Marks, who ended up writing the first book about MK Ultra called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Mm-hmm. It came out, I think, in 77 or 78. And then I discovered that there were actual Senate and congressional hearings where the CIA had to testify and they had witnesses called up who were part of the program. But it was mostly a sham investigation. I mean, they allowed the CIA to lie when they knew they were lying about what they'd accomplished and not release records. You know, they should have prosecuted Gottlieb, who was the kind of the mad scientist or the poisoner in chief, as he was called. And Helms should have, you know, that they broke federal law by destroying 20 years of records to protect themselves and the agency. But, you know, our taxpayer dollars paid for that 20 years of research. That all should have been archived and saved and kept, but they destroyed it. But nobody did anything about it because there was still that Cold War kind of paranoia that these guys were doing it for patriotic reasons and to prevent it, you know, from preventing the opposition to have something like that. But once I learned about it and saw that it really happened, then I became kind of a what if guy. Like, you know, what did they do then? What did they destroy? And that kind of, you know, blew up into a 20-year effort to find out whether these murders that were committed by the followers of Manson had anything to do with MK Ultra, you know, operations.
Now let's break down kind of the process of brainwashing or being able to control somebody's mind. I mean, I know that LSD is a huge part of your research when it comes to how to achieve that. But from what I've read from people like David McGowan, apparently splitting someone's personality through either trauma or, you know, something that LSD would be a perfect tool for is essential into controlling somebody's mind. You essentially torture them to a point to where their core personality splits.
It's called dissociation.
Yeah, multiple personality disorder, or DID.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, you know, one of the reasons they became so interested in LSD. People would completely, as Manson said, lose their ego, and they wouldn't be present, and they were, you know, vulnerable to being told things that weren't necessarily true or persuaded to think certain things. And what this is what's interesting, I think, and what happened at the same time. Manson was going to this clinic at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic where Jolly West was recruiting subjects for MK Ultra research, and Jolly West is, you know, a pretty important person in my book. Somebody who was a contracted scientist for the CIA from about 52 till probably about 68, 69. Could have been longer, but that's what I was able to document. Who was, you know, one of their chief researchers, and at the time and place, 1967, Haight-Ashbury, he and other MK Ultra affiliated researchers were trying to learn why different people, or why some people reacted differently to one LSD trip. So someone could have an LSD trip and when it ended, think, you know, be virtually the same person, where some people would have these absolute complete personality changes. And starting around 63, 64, the CIA was financing research. A lot of it was at colleges with students who didn't know what they were being given. They were also doing it in federal institutions like jails and prisons, and they would give people, they would do personality profiles first, like have them take all these written tests and find out, you know, what their belief systems entail. Like, did they believe in God? Did they believe in afterlife? Did they believe in good and bad? And, you know, what was their moral code? And then give them this LSD, sometimes more than once, and then give them the same test or observe them or actually have one-on-one conversations. And some people would have the exact same personality and belief system before, as they had before taking LSD as after, whereas other people would all of a sudden have this personality change. And this is what Manson learned to do when he was looking for followers. He would find susceptible people who he could control through other means of coercion too, but particularly through LSD use, where their whole personality would switch and then stick that way and stay that way. And the ones who were the hardcore followers were the ones who never left him, even, the ones that didn't go to prison, but for years after were still acolytes and still, speaking out on his behalf. Some of them still do, Sandra Good, Squeaky Fromme. I know a couple others, personally who haven't been public, but they still believe that Manson was like a messiah. So it really stuck with some of those people. Was it, just because Manson lucked into a method of brainwashing people, or was he given help, or were other people involved? That's what my book was trying to discover.
Yeah, and so your main question becomes, well, where did he learn that?
Yeah.
How is he emulating essentially exactly what intelligence agencies at the same exact time are doing? How close have we gotten to proving, we know that the operations existed, but have we gotten close to proving that they were successful and worked?
Excuse me, that's one of the most interesting questions. Because the CIA said, no, nothing worked. So when they had these hearings beginning in 75 through 77, 78, there were 3 or 4 of them, the Pike Commission, the Church Commission, the Kennedy Inouye hearings. They would parade out CIA officials, and these weren't the ones that were the hands-on operatives. These were the administrative ones, the financial guys, who really didn't know what was being done. All of it was compartmentalized. And they would testify under oath that, we wasted, I think it was $20 or $30 million, which was a lot of money for like a 20-year program back in the 50s and then 60s. It was completely futile. Nothing was gained. And the headlines in the newspapers covering the hearings called it the doctors that couldn't shoot straight. There was a movie called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight about a bumbling mafia family. And the CIA allowed themselves to look like fools, which I haven't proven. I think I kind of have, and I think others have too. That was a cover, that they allowed themselves to be humiliated because they needed to protect that science that they had learned and created and developed. And they couldn't say, oh yeah, we did actually learn how to create program killers. I mean, Milton Klein, who was one of their scientists, told me in an on-the-record interview, he said, most people won't say it, but I saw people in experiments programmed to kill, and they would shoot someone thinking that they were firing a gun that had a bullet, but we would put a blank in it. So we created it. It's a lie that we didn't. And West said in one of his papers, when he wasn't right, I mean, he didn't admit in his lifetime that he had anything to do with it, but he talked about other people doing research into hypnotism, and a big argument about why people thought you couldn't create mind-controlled assassins was people believe that if you're hypnotized, you won't do anything that's against your own code of ethics, that you might do stuff like, look at your dog and think it's a cat or something, but you're not going to kill somebody if you wouldn't do that normally. But what they don't know, and this is what the scientists told me who participated in this, and it's in actual documents, is they would brainwash someone into thinking like a gun that they were pointing at someone was a cap gun or a toy gun, or that they were about to be killed, so they were shooting someone in self-defense.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to find someone who was a sociopath who wanted to murder and then trigger it. You would get people to, not know what was happening, to disassociate their consciousness.
Jesus. And, this is coming from, an intelligence agency that's funded and sponsored assassinations and coups and, pretty much civilian massacres. And, it's clear that there's little that they wouldn't justify in the name of national security.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of unsettling, especially like there are some portions in your book where it's like you mentioned that the Senate is investigating this case of mind control over here and that these people didn't know what was going on, and then this new owner took over and he wasn't allowed to know what's going on. And it's like, who's running the ship? Is it the White House? Is it the CIA? Like, who should we be afraid of?
Well, one of the CIA directors, so Ellen Dulles was fired by John F. Kennedy. 6 or 7 months later, Kennedy was assassinated, and Dulles was on the commission to investigate his assassination. But his replacement, I think his name was Combs, I get them mixed up, or McCone, when MK Ultra was exposed in 1975, he said he was the director of the CIA. This was going on beneath him, and he didn't even know about it. It was all need to know.
Mm-hmm.
So everything was, separated. So people didn't know what the right hand was doing to the left, and that was how they protected themselves,
I believe they realized that in order to effectively control someone's mind, it had to be an unwitting subject.
Well, that was mostly for the experimental part. If someone was witting, you couldn't get, it's like why they use, what do you call it? When you do a drug test and you give someone a placebo and someone the authentic drug, they have to think they're taking an authentic drug, because if you know you're getting a fake drug, you're going to not manifest. So the reason you used unwitting people was it was an authentic response to whatever you did to them. And a lot of people wouldn't be witting because the experiments were really dangerous. I mean, they were fucking around with people's minds. And one of the most chilling things that West had written, Jolly West, in his letters to Gottlieb, was at one point when he'd been doing this for 2 or 3 years, he talked about how effective his work was in a mental hospital in Oklahoma, because he was experimenting on people who had mental disorders so he could get them to do aberrant behavior, and nobody would think twice because they're mentally ill people.
Jesus.
But, that's your most precious commodity, is your mind. And they didn't care. They were Nazi-like. I mean, it was so inhumane, some of the stuff they did.
Yeah, and those are the people who are running the ship. Those are the puppet masters.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about how you initially got into the story of Manson is that you weren't ever really into it. It was kind of this story that's always been overtold and blown out of proportion. When they came to you and asked you to write a story, you were just like, "This." I
just did it for the paycheck. I didn't. My editor had to talk me into doing it.
But when you read Helter Skelter, you had gone through the book and you were like, holy shit, okay, I see what this is all about.
Well, I read it and was pretty amazed. I mean, it moves really fast. It's pretty gripping. I immediately sensed that the author and the prosecutor had a massive ego.
Yeah.
And that he was, could be a difficult person, but I never had any, foreknowledge that he and I would end up mortal enemies, as he called us. But I read the book and I thought it was amazing. And then I still didn't know what to write because it was so thorough. I'm like, what am I going to find out? When I got the assignment, it was in 1999. So it was 30 years after the murders. And I thought, what am I going to, there have been a million stories even then. There have been double or triple that since then. But magazine stories, books, films, what's new? And that's kind of how I cracked it open, is when I interviewed him. And he was very generous with his time. I spent 6 hours with him, I think, the first day. I asked him towards the end of the interview, and I've talked about this, I think, even with you before, we call it the Hail Mary pass in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was talking nonstop, and he was very generous and patient with me, but I knew he wasn't giving me anything that he hadn't been giving other journalists for 30 years or writing in his own books or lecturing about himself. So I asked him, I said, if there's anything you could tell me that hasn't been reported about this very well-known case that you know better than anybody probably on the planet, what can you tell me, or what kind of lead can you give me to pursue that would give me a way into this story that's fresh and different? And that's when he probably very regrettably paused and then said to turn off my recorder. And he told me something off the record which strangely enough, and it's explained in the book, it wasn't that explosive. I mean, it was shocking. But the fact that he told me what he told me, it had another meaning that made it significant for a different reason that he wasn't aware of at the time. And had he not done that, had he said, there's nothing, it's really, I've told you everything I know, and, it's an interesting story, find your own angle or whatever, I probably would have turned the piece around in 3 months and gone on and, probably been even more destitute now because there's no journalism and I wouldn't have made a living at it.
Yeah.
But if he hadn't done that, I think none of this would have happened.
Yeah.
So it was his.
Well, let's walk back through that day when you first met up with him. I mean, the first thing I want to know is how soon after Helter Skelter did you reach out to Bugliosi?
Well, so when I get an assignment, I was doing features and I had started doing profiles of stars for an entertainment magazine. I did it for a few years. It was fun in the beginning. I lived in New York. They'd fly me to Hollywood, put me up in a hip hotel in Sunset, give me a car, give me an expense account. That's when magazines had money and people bought print.
Yeah.
And I'd spend 2 or 3 days with Tom Cruise or Harrison Ford.
You said he yelled at you, right? Tom Cruise?
Yeah, a couple. We had a couple.
What was it about?
There were 2 arguments. The first one was about, it's kind of obscure, especially if your listeners are under the age of 30. But one of the first big features he did after he became famous, his first kind of movie that he produced himself was called Far and Away. And it was a love story that takes place in Ireland. And he cast Nicole Kidman in it. And I can't remember if he cast her because he was already in love with her and wanted a way to make her his wife, or if that happened once they were shooting. But they played Irish immigrants. Here's the funny thing. I still have not seen it to this day. So it's about, he's an Irishman. I think the whole thing takes place in Ireland. Maybe they moved to America. It's a period film. So I was driving a horse and carriage in Central Park, and I was just kind of finding my footing as a journalist, but I didn't trust it because I'd never studied it, never took a journalism class, never worked on a school paper. I wanted to be a playwright and a screenwriter, and I got a job driving horses in Central Park to pay my rent in my apartment in Manhattan, and I would write while I was on the carriage between rides, just shit, And then I started submitting stuff to magazines, kind of first-person humor pieces or observation stuff about what I saw as a driver. And I found out that I had, a talent for it, and I was getting paid. And then I got hired by a couple different magazines and papers to, be given assignments. And this one woman, Leslie, who became a good friend and an editor through like 3 different magazines that we both went from one to the other, she had hired me to do celebrity profiles. And I think he was my first cover story. So she flew me out to LA. And at the time, we didn't have what you guys have now, streaming. Mm-hmm. We had VHS. So far, what they'll do is when you get an assignment, they'll give you all the clips. Like I would read all of Tom Cruise's interviews in a week or 2 before I went to talk to him to see what he's already talked about that you don't want to ask him again. Find out what's interesting about something he said that maybe you can expand upon, probably what you did before you talked to me. It's just, part of the process. And then watch their most recent movies to talk to them a little bit about them. So Cruise was already pretty powerful and pretty controlling. And he had this little game he played where he would handpick a journalist. And he would only do people usually that he had never interviewed him before, might be a little intimidated by him. And he wouldn't let you know that his publicist wouldn't inform the magazine that he'd agreed to it until like 2 or 3 days before it's supposed to take place. So I got a call from my editor saying, so we want you to do Tom Cruise for a new movie he has coming out called A Few Good Men, which was a real good movie with Jack Nicholson and Demi Moore. But you have to fly to LA tomorrow, and then you're going to interview him. I think it was that night or the next day. And I said, well, how am I going to see? There's like 3 or 4 movies he'd made at that point that I hadn't seen. And she goes, just pick one. And it's more important that you read his clips. So we'll send you all the clips. They had people at the magazine who would compile. So I remember I was flying out there and the guy next to me said, I just have to ask, why are you reading are you like an obsessed fan? You're reading all these Tom Cruise stories? Because they were all mimeographed. And I said, no, I'm actually interviewing him. And long story short, I jumped. We're in the Beverly Hills Hotel in a bungalow that the studio had rented for him to do my interview. And we actually had a history together. I worked on a movie called Taps, which was shot in my hometown. It was about a military academy that gets taken over by the cadets. And it starred Tom Cruise, Timothy Hutton, and Sean Penn, and George C. Scott. And I got a job on that. So he didn't remember me, and I knew he wouldn't. I was just a little peon on it. But when I met him, I was able to say, you and I actually met before. And I go, and I know it was an important movie for you because that's the movie that kind of broke him out. He had been in one movie before that called Endless Love, which was a Brooke Shields romance movie, and he had one line in it. This movie, he became a star. And I said, this is my first cover story, and that was your first movie. And he was very gracious. He jumped up. Oh, I remember you, bro. And he's hugging me, and I knew he didn't remember, but that's Tom Cruise. So I thought we were going to be buds, but I started talking about the films he'd done at that point. There were 4 or 5 of them. And then the last one he had done was Far and Away. And I said, so was it disappointing that Far and Away didn't, make any money? Or I can't remember how I worded it. However I worded it, it triggered him.
Yeah.
He goes, what do you mean it wasn't a success? I think I said unsuccessful. I go, well, your movies have all been blockbusters. And I know this was like the first thing that you personally invested in and you produced, and now you're married or getting married to your leading lady. I know it meant a lot to you. Was it disappointing that more people didn't? Because a lot of people saw, what did you think about it? And I said, I didn't see it. And he goes, well, how dare you say to me that it's a disappointing film if you never even saw it? And I go, honestly, the reason I didn't see it is because I only was informed that I was doing this 48 hours ago, and I had to fly from the East Coast and meet you. I didn't have time. I don't even know if it was available on VHS yet because they would take a year or whatever, or in the studio didn't get it. I go, it wasn't my fault. And he goes, well, who told you it was bad? I go, you really want to know? He goes, yeah. And I said, I drive a horse and carriage in Central Park, and about 2/3 of the drivers are Irish immigrants, and they're my friends.
Yeah.
And when they heard I was coming to see you, they said, I hope you don't have to see that piece of shite Far and Away. I go, and I said to them, what's the matter with it? And they said, it's like a Hallmark card version of Ireland, and his accent is horrible, and nothing is real. So everything went downhill. He got really defensive and pissed. Then we kind of recovered, and then I had to ask him about Scientology, and he got furious at my line of questioning about that.
Were you more skeptic? Were you?
Well, no. You also want, if they're in the news about something, you have to ask him about it because it's topical. So he had just gotten a ton of criticism from the American Dyslexic Association because he had announced in another interview or somewhere that he had cured himself of dyslexia through the study of Scientology and through these mineral sauna things that they take at the Celebrity Center. And it was absurd. You can't cure yourself of it. You can learn to live with it. And I was just quoting what these leading researchers in dyslexia had said. And he just, he was really angry, and I thought he was going to leave. I'm like, no, we're friends. Remember Taps?
Yeah.
So it was actually a good interview, and it got a lot of attention because I kept all the conflict in.
Yeah.
Actually, now I got onto all that because you asked me something about this Manson story, and I started talking about the celebrity profiles. Oh, and then I started doing investigative pieces because I got tired of the egos. Harrison Ford. They would give me all the alpha males, that women would cower from, or guys, that could be a pain in the ass. Alec Baldwin, who I got in a fight with, Harrison Ford, who
a physical fight.
His assistant said he left the trailer because it became so heated. And the assistant said to me later, he goes, I'm so sorry. I left the trailer because I was so sure you guys were going to come to blows. And if I had to try to break it up, I thought I was going to get hurt. So I left. But we didn't come to blows. And, other guys who are kind of alpha, but I really liked were Anthony Hopkins, Woody Harrelson, oh gosh, Michael Richards, Kramer, you know.
Wow.
Some of them were great, but some of them are just dicks. And I said, I don't want to do those anymore. I want to do investigative, like of the entertainment industry. So I started doing those, and then our magazine got sold and became much more tabloidy and stupid. So everybody from the masthead went over to Premiere Magazine, which was a monthly good film magazine. And I was still a contributor at Us, the old magazine. And Leslie, my editor at Us, said, we want you here at Premiere. You just have to do one big piece for us at Premiere, and then we'll put you on the masthead and give you a contract, which is what you want. So I'm like, I don't want to do this. Manson, Helter Skelter. I know you asked me when I met Vince after reading the book.
Yeah, well, you know, because it's like the day sounded really fun. I mean, one of the things I remember is you said like he drove you around to a couple of those spots.
Yeah.
Where did he drive you?
He drove me to the gas station where Linda Kasabian. At that point, I believed him. To this day, I'm not sure it really happened, but she hid Rosemary LaBianca's wallet under the toilet tank.
Yeah, and Charlie got milkshakes.
Then they got milkshakes. I'm not so sure that happened. He drove me to that gas station. I hope it's in the book. He drove me to 2 or 3 other. We were mostly in the Valley because he lived in Pasadena, and he took me to his favorite lunch place there, and that had some connection too. But, you know, and then we went back to his house and talked more for a few hours. And I remember the sun was setting when I asked him that question. But to answer the question you asked like 15 minutes ago, I did my normal prep. I got a lot of clips and interviews that he had done about the book and the case. And then I had to read Helter Skelter. And, you know, I came up with questions, but I was really worried going in because I thought, I don't know how to make this an interesting story. I mean, and my working angle was, how did it affect Hollywood? What reverberations are there 30 years later as far as how celebrities now, you know, separate themselves from the public, protect themselves? You know, famously after Sharon Tate was killed, there's a line in Bugliosi's book where, you know, all the Hollywood people flushed their drugs down the toilet. They bought guns. They got guard dogs. They put up walls.
All of the LA sewage system was stoned.
Something like that. Yeah. You probably have read it more recently than I. I haven't read Helter Skelter since 1999.
It's a solid book, and you know when you in your book you start getting into when Vince was getting mad at you. I'm like, fuck. If there's one guy you don't want mad at you, it's Vincent Bugliosi.
Yeah. He was. Well, I'll save some of that for later because it'd be jumping ahead. But I think he was, let's just say, I don't think he was all that stable. And I found out stuff later where I found out I wasn't a one lone voice saying this guy's insane. I heard it from lots and lots of people the more I dug into his life and his career.
But when you initially met up with him, it was strictly about your initial angle of like, hey, just find out how the Manson family and all those murders impacted. So
well, it was really, I was kind of like, what do you call it, spitballing, just seeing if he could, even before I asked him that question, I thought, you know, I read Ed Sanders' book too, The Family, which is much more conspiratorial and speculative. And I would ask him about some of the reporting in The Family, because at the time in 99, there were really only 2 books that authoritatively told the story of the Manson case. Vince's, which was the most authoritative because it was by the prosecutor, and then Ed Sanders, who was kind of like a hippie journalist who covered the case from the very beginning because he was working for the underground press in Los Angeles, the LA Free Press. And he embedded himself at the Spahn Ranch with Manson family members, but he would take rumors and just report them first in the reporting he did at the LA Free Press, and then when he published The Family. So not surprisingly, Sanders and Vince didn't like each other very much. And then I guess less surprisingly, neither of them liked me. You know, even Sanders turned against me really quickly. And he's still alive, and he still, I heard, is not happy with me, but I don't care.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a touchy subject. People don't like to think that there could possibly be more than what they already know.
Oh, yeah. And I have a lot of critics of my book, and I hope I'm more kind of nonchalant about it because I've been through it. And I respect people coming at me as long as they're, if they're coming to me with facts and saying, I don't understand how you can report that when you say this elsewhere or there's this document, I'm reasonable about that, I hope. I mean, if I'm not, I want to be called out on it. Vince and Sanders weren't. I mean, they both freaked out when I started finding holes in their reporting, and that's where everything went haywire with the two of them, where both of them were calling people before I spoke to them and telling them not to speak to me, that kind of thing.
Well, with Vince, I think sometimes I can't tell, like, was he getting that offended because he's just already inherently an egomaniac?
Yeah.
The fact that anybody was just questioning his motive, was he getting pissed off, or was there something that he was hiding? And now the initial narrative of Vincent Bugliosi's, which is kind of the common narrative, the narrative that I took as truth, by the way. I mean, I didn't think that it was the helter-skelter theory. I just thought that's what happened. And, come to find out, the guy inflated some of these things. But, I mean, I think before we get to that, you met up with him and you said that he was kind of just running you through the same old shit. He was just saying everything you've already heard in interviews.
It was on autopilot.
What exactly were you questioning him about that you were hoping to get something different? Was it motive-based, or did that kind of unfurl after you talked to him?
It was stuff about, I was really interested in the drug dealing going on at the house. Talks
at the
about
Tate house?
At the Tate house, yeah. Wojciech was selling drugs. Wojciech, one of the victims, Frykowski.
And you knew about that prior to meeting up with Vince for the first time?
Well, Vince talks about the police believing that Wojciech was selling drugs, and it might have been a drug burn kind of murder, like he had sold them bad drugs or not paid for drugs. And then they found out about the Manson family, and they put that aside. I was never convinced, and even to this day, if you read my book, you see that I'm not so sure that there wasn't some element of those guys' involvement in this too, because I was able to, I don't know if I proved it 100%, but I have 2 or 3 sources of people saying that Manson knew and had been seen with Wojciech Frykowski, and also with Billy Doyle and Charles Taco and Tom Harrigan and Pick Dawson, who, you got to be deep into the lore of the story to know who they are.
That's what I love about, I think it's a line that you wrote, in order to be able to fully comprehend this whole story, you have to understand the cast of characters.
I know, it's hard, and I should have put a character list at the front of the book. That's another criticism. Well, it's one of the criticisms I get. They're like, couldn't you have made a character list so we could follow it? And I said, you know what? I have that as a note to ask Little Brown if they're going to do a new edition in the I think in the winter, to see if I can get them 20 pages to have like a character outline of who's who and where they fit in.
With how big the book's gotten, it's insane that you still have to negotiate what to add to it.
Well, I don't know if I have to. I mean, maybe they'll be like, "Oh, of course." I don't, because I haven't asked for anything really yet, so we'll see. But
well, it was an ultimatum. It was between that or the end notes, right?
Yeah.
And you chose the end notes.
Yeah.
But that's great that, and it goes to show your character with this whole thing, because you were like, no, I want to give people all of the sources in which I found this information. And
that's really important.
Right.
So they can go and double check. I want people, and that's the problem with the audiobook. A lot of people buy the audiobook, but you don't get the end notes. In fact, I could also ask them if they can make the end notes available online, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so people who have the audiobook can maybe go to even my website. Maybe I can do that.
Right. That you definitely could.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we live in the age of self-promotion.
I know.
Could build the biggest brand. So I feel like you could put all your own stuff up on your own website.
I mean, actually, I'm just articulating it now for the first time. All I have to do, it's like just doing an Instagram post, is scan the end notes I've already written.
Yeah.
And just make them available on my site.
Dude, your Instagram page is awesome. Like,
thank you.
love some of you'll read interactions between you and somebody else in the book.
Yeah.
But then you'll post the audio clip on your Instagram. And I love hearing what I read in the book in the audio.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh, wow, he really did say, I'm going to chop your balls off and feed it to you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that was Rudy. Yeah, as I was talking to you about this a few days ago, I get a lot of, people bust my chops about how kind of raw my Instagram videos are because I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm like, well, if I hired someone to do them professionally, I feel like they would lose my personal touch. And it's more important that I get it out than I learn how to do it better. I mean, I think I've gotten better over the years, but I almost put one up this morning, but I didn't have time once I got that tour thing I did. I'll probably do it tomorrow. I don't do them that often anymore, but I'm going to try to do more of them.
Do it. That's a great podcast series right there.
I'm actually not allowed to do a podcast series yet because I don't own the content of the book anymore. Until Netflix's contract expires. I mean, I can throw stuff up there. Nobody's going to do anything. But if I actually tried to create, especially if I tried to monetize something, I think they might not be happy with that. But that's just another year, I think.
Yeah.
I'm reporting the second book, and when I think of that kind of technology stuff, that just scares the hell out of me because it would take me forever to do the mechanics of that. Pulling everything out. Yeah, I got to do my reporting. That's more important.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the whole struggle, right? I mean, it's the same thing with this show because I'm the editor as well.
Right.
So sometimes I'm torn between, am I the host today or am I the editor today?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's more important to, be the host.
Yeah.
So, but let's go back to Bugliosi. So you went to him without any concept of what Chaos ended up being. He ended up running you through the same kind of spiel you've seen in all the interviews you've already read in Helter Skelter. But there were a couple of things he said to you in that first initial meeting that kind of rattled the cages and made you go, okay, wait, there might be something more to this.
The very first one was what he told me off the record, which, I mean, I can explain it. It takes like 10 minutes if you want.
Yeah, let's do it.
So he said, turn off the tape. And then he said to me, what people don't know is that this videotape that was taken from the loft, so Sharon and Roman's house had a loft. And if you ever have seen crime scene photos, there's a rafter that a rope was thrown over, and Sharon had a noose around her neck, and another noose was put around Abigail's neck.
Jay's.
Well, it ended up at Jay's, but first it was Abigail, and she got free. And they were trying, if they struggled, the noose would tighten. And they think that when Jay died, after Abigail, I think it somehow went from Abigail, I can't remember now. And believe me, the people who follow the case are going to be furious that I can't remember these details. But anyway, yeah, it ended up, the coroner said that Sharon, from the ligature marks on her neck and the blood pooling, he thought she'd been hung while she was alive, with her feet in the air, and then dropped. But that rafter, there's a loft up there, and on the loft there was a videotape, at least one, I don't know, maybe there were more, that was taken by the police. And Vince refers to it in the book and says the LAPD looked at it, and it was just a video of Sharon and Roman making love. And Vince writes in the book that he told them to put it back and let Roman find it whenever he returns to the house. It's his personal property. We don't need that. So what Vince told me that day was actually, it wasn't a tape of them just making love. It was Sharon being, I don't think he used the word rape, but having intercourse with two men, clearly against her will, and Roman was directing it. And I said, that's not in your book. He goes, and yes, I'm telling you that off the record, you could never attribute that to me, but that's what was on the tape. And I said, did you see it? And he kind of hesitated, and he said, I didn't see it. That's what I was told by one of the officers who saw it. And he said, but I told them to put it back. So there were two things wrong with this. The first thing is, and I didn't know this because I had never really done crime reporting. I'd done one story about a woman who was murdered like a year before, but I was really new to evidentiary rules and stuff like that. So the first suspect in the murder of a spouse is the other spouse, always.
Yeah.
Even if they didn't do it, that's the first person they look at. Roman was out of the country when it happened, but if Roman was forcing his wife to have sex with two men against her will, that raised his profile as a suspect. That should have been kept in evidence. What I didn't understand until much later was Vince couldn't have been the one to tell. He wrote it in the book, and he told me that day. He wrote in the book that it was them making love, and he told the police to put it back. he told me that day the same thing, except he added that it was her not making love to Roman, but two other guys. He said, and I told them to put it back. He couldn't have told them to put it back because he wasn't on the case until November. This was in August. They took the tapes August 8th or 9th or 10th. Roman went back to the house, I think on the 11th. And Vince writes that Roman went up to the loft and he kind of surreptitiously took the tapes and left with them. So what I was never able to ask Vince when I figured out the second part, which is even bigger, was he lying to me when he told me, I mean, number one, was he lying about her being raped by two men? And if so, why? I could never confirm that. Why would he tell me that unless it were true? And then the second part that actually troubled me more when I found out other stuff later about the true narrative of the investigation and the case is why would he say that he told them to put it back when he wasn't anywhere near the case?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe was he on it much sooner and he kept that a secret? Because he makes it very clear in the book about halfway through Helter Skelter. The first part is written in the third person and it's about the murders, the investigation, and then it stops and part two begins with him saying, writing in the first person, it was just a normal day at the DA's office or something. And then Aaron Stovitz came into my office and said, "You're not going to believe this, Vince. We have a meeting with Evel Younger or something." And Vince said, "I had no idea, but I was about to be asked to prosecute this case." So again, it's hard for people who haven't read the book. I found out so many, that was the very first idiosyncrasy I found out about what he was telling that was true and not true. Then that multiplied the more reporting I did until it kind of like exploded. And
was it that his lie kind of put his ego into perspective for you, where you're like, oh shit, well, not only did I catch him in this lie, but he's also this egomaniac. It was within weeks or months, a few months, I started hearing stories about him. Because then he was really like the second or third interview I did. I think the first person I interviewed was Julian Wasser, who photographed the crime scene, the house. He went up there with Polanski when Polanski visited for the first time. Time magazine, right?
Yeah, and he did the famous photograph of Roman kind of crouching in front of the door with pig written in blood. And then Roman in the bedroom near the baby bassinet looking at the baby. Yeah.
I wish you would have gotten one shot of Peter Hurkos.
Oh, don't get me started on Hurkos. That guy is such a fucking mystery to me too. I have a whole ton of reporting on him that I'm not going to get into now. It probably will be in the second book, how he ended up there, why he was there. I'm impressed that you know him because he's probably not even named in my book, or if he is, it's peripheral. It's not he's an important person, but yeah.
Interesting. See, I don't know his importance. All I know is that he was a psychic.
Yeah, with some really weird spook backgrounds and connections. I don't mean spook ghost, I mean spook undercover intelligence.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's
There's
spicy.
a news flash, yeah.
Chaos 2, ladies and
Oh
gentlemen.
yeah, exactly. But so the Vince thing, when I started stumbling into more information, it was prefaced by me. After I talked to him, I started talking to cops. And I didn't even understand that it was I just thought it just raised questions like, wait a minute, wouldn't this make Roman a suspect? Why would he be given this back? He needed to be questioned about it. That's, depending on how you look at it, if it's a rape, Vince was clearly saying that it was against her will. And it just raises all kinds of red flags. So for me, again, in my elementary, Boy Scout beginning as an investigative reporter stage, it was just more like, you're not supposed to protect the feelings of the deceased family. If this is an important piece of information, it should be in the trial. It should be shared with the defense. And he's also saying that he twisted the narrative in his book, and that was incredibly generous and maybe stupid of him to do with me. I would love if he were still alive. He stopped talking to me about 3 years before he died, and I couldn't ask him a lot of the questions. But that was one of the biggest questions I wanted to ask him. It did come up later, because when I did interview him and we had become adversaries like 6 years later, he wrote the first of about a half dozen letters to my then publisher threatening to sue them and sue me. And as he said, I will own Penguin Press. I will own O'Neill the rest of his life
Pages
if you
and
publish
pages long
this.
too, right?
Yeah, the first one was 30 pages, single space with like 50. And the lawyer at Penguin Press said, I got to ask you something. Is he senile? Does he have a dementia? Because he's not. He was only like 71. And I said, no. This is how he always is. And he's actually got a book that's about to come out that's this magnus opus about the Kennedy assassination. And he's on lecture tours. He is psychotic. And the lawyer said to me, he goes, this is heartbreaking for me because I was in law school during the trial in Los Angeles. And we, it wasn't on TV, but we followed it in the papers and on the nightly news. And he was our hero. I mean, he was a giant. And now I look at this and I can't believe that the man who prosecuted this case wrote this letter. It's not only is it incoherent, but it's kind of insane. I mean, that the arguments he's making don't make sense, especially from a legal standpoint. I'm a lawyer, he's a lawyer, and what he's putting on paper is even more incriminating.
Yeah.
So, and in that letter, he said to me, he brings that up, which enabled me to put it on the record, because the minute he went off the record and put it in this letter, and he said that he was going to sue me, and he goes, that's going to be part of the evidence. It's crazy about where all that went, but I don't want you to give me more credit than I deserve. When he said that to me, I knew it was important, but I couldn't figure out how right away. Then these cops started telling me stories about how mentally ill he was. Then his own co-prosecutor, Aaron Stovitz, told me stories about, and then I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't a normal human being. Then I found out about his prior history with this milkman case where he had become convinced 2 years before he got assigned this big case that made his career, he had become convinced that the milkman had fathered his son on the route.
Vincent Bugliosi Jr., correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, it's kind of it's a joke, the milkman is always, having sex with the people on his route. But what was horrifying about this is, it's his right to think his wife slept with the milkman, but what he did was he used the DA's office and his position there to investigate the milkman. And he had him tailed. He wrote down on these documents where he would send DA's investigators to get paperwork on him. Not that he thought he fathered his child, but that he was the suspect in a case or a witness. He just made shit up.
Jesus Christ. Didn't he threaten to plant narcotics in a locker as well?
This was another story. Then I learned 2 or 3 more of these episodes of his. So yeah, there was a journalist named Mary Nieswenderer who I love, and I actually just got an email this afternoon from she's written a book. She's like 95, and I haven't talked to her for I think 10 years. She was a great source. I used to meet with her. Salty old, print news reporter for 30 years, covered every big case in LA. She and Vince hated each other. All the women that covered the Manson trial, Vince despised them. He hates women. He's kind of like Trump. He doesn't like women. And he was horrible to them. But she was going to write about, I can't remember what it was, but he sent an emissary to her, and they said, I have a message from Vince. He was still in the DA's office. If you report this, he knows where your kids go to school. There's going to be narcotics found in their locker if you do this. And she told me all this on the record. She said, it's the first time and only time I've ever pulled off a story because I was terrified. She goes, he's capable of anything. And I started hearing that again and again. And then later he was threatening me with similar stuff. But once in the first months, I started hearing stories about his bad behavior with, the mistress thing and beating women up and stuff like that. And then lying to the police when he was caught. I'm like, this guy, anything's possible with him. And that allowed me to start, at least rationalizing to myself, looking into more extreme possibilities and going down more dead ends and rabbit holes. Cause anything. It was kind of like open game at that point when I found out how nutty the prosecutor was. Like, he would do anything. He wanted to write a best-selling book.
Well, I feel his co-writer, Kurt Gentry,
was in the courtroom from day one.
Yeah.
And Kurt Gentry told me that himself. He said, I went to that trial every day. Vince put me in he lied and said I was related to one of the victims' families. That's how I got in there. And said, they had seating reserved because otherwise you had to wait in line.
Yeah.
Or you had to be part of the press pool. And he was, he was a book author who Vince hired to write the book.
How did you get in contact with Melcher? Because I feel like Terry Melcher is one of those cast members in the whole narrative of Helter Skelter that, plays a pretty important piece in everything.
Oh, very important, yeah.
But Vince downplays it a lot.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, when people read the book, they'll find out why.
Well, let's get into the why. So it was said that Terry Melcher didn't know any of them. He knew Manson.
He had met Manson 2.5 times, 3 times before the murders. I found out that he met him much more often than that. I found out that he had a Manson family member living at his house with him for months, Dean Morehouse. Tex Watson had been inside the house many times when Terry was there. He had met Candice Berg and his girlfriend. Vince hid all that, kept all that from the defense and from the jury and his readers.
And this is fact.
Yeah. Well, it's in Vince. I have Vince's own interviews with people talking about Terry, people he used as witnesses, seeing Terry at the Spahn Ranch after the murders had been committed.
And now Dean Morehouse, you're saying, lived in the house. Now, for the viewers at home, if you're not recognizing the last name Morehouse, that's Ruth Ann Morehouse's father.
Right.
She was nicknamed Wish.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy, right? Not even an ex. A Manson family member's father was living in the Cielo Drive house at some point.
Yeah, well, he was one of Manson's first followers, and so was Wish. He had taken his first LSD trip with Manson when Manson was in Northern California, up in Ukiah. Dean was an evangelical minister who had left Minnesota after he got caught, arrested and put on probation for some kind of bank fraud or some kind of financial crimes. And he violated his probation, moved his family to California, met Manson. I think he picked Manson up hitchhiking, and he was in his 40s, I think, which seemed old then for the hippie world. But he was a pretty straight-laced guy, even though he had this one crime on his record. But he had also a 13-year-old daughter named Ruth Ann who was cute. And Manson liked her, so Manson gave Dean LSD, and Dean was one of the people who completely, with one trip, became enlightened, became a hippie, grew his hair long, and gave his daughter to Manson for his pleasure. And then Manson's first arrest after being released, he was released in March of 1967. I can't remember, I think it was June of 1967. Morehouse's wife, who he was still married to, hadn't seen her daughter or her husband for like a month, and was able to find out that they were living with Manson in a cabin in the woods. So she called the police, and the police went to get the girl, and they arrested Morehouse, and then Manson tried to prevent them from getting Ruth Ann. So they arrested Manson, and Manson was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor and interfering with the police officer. Pretty serious charges for someone who's just been paroled 2 months before.
Right.
But again, this is all in the book. The parole officer looked the other way and, let Manson stay out. But from that point on, then Morehouse and Ruth moved with Manson down to L.A., and Manson moved into Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boy drummer's house, with about 8 or 9 of his followers, and with Dean. But somebody at the house didn't like Dean. I don't know if it was some of the other Manson girls or Dennis. So Dean moved in with Terry in the summer of 1968, Terry Melcher.
The start of the Golden Penetrators.
Yeah.
Solid name, by the way.
I didn't name them that. They named themselves that.
I think it's a solid name for 3...
3 cockswingers.
Yeah, cockswingers.
Greg Jacobson, Terry Melcher, and Dennis Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's it.
And it was true. They were, they were gold. Dennis was a rock star. Terry was the privileged son of Doris Day, and he was, a talented producer. and Greg was the hanger-on, and they could go out and fuck whatever they wanted, whoever they wanted to on Sunset, and they did.
Manson's connection to the Hollywood elite is always so interesting to me, because you'd never think that some 5'4", hippie would be so connected, especially with somebody like Terry Melcher, who was a famous producer at the time. You've got Dennis Wilson, who was a part of the Beach Boys, and the Beach Boys were like the biggest in the 60s.
They really were. I mean, they were peaking. They were just about to go down because the Beatles had come in. But, some of the best music Brian Wilson composed was those couple of years, but it wasn't really understood how important like Good Vibrations was and some of that music until a bunch of years later. But they were at the height of their fame, yeah.
Did you get in contact with Melcher first or Altobelli?
Altobelli first.
So Altobelli is who owns the Cielo Drive house. He is who rented out the house to Polanski and Sharon Tate.
And to Terry prior to Polanski.
And to Terry prior, yeah. So Terry moved out, but Altobelli was always the owner.
And he would live in the guest house and rent out the main house because he didn't need all that room, and he liked being back in the guest house. I got to him first, and he had never given interviews until he talked to me. And, again, a lot of this is about luck and timing. People had tried to interview him for decades, and he wouldn't talk about it. He was a key witness. He was an important prosecution witness. And he was a well-known figure around town, but the murders, like a bunch of people, kind of ruined him financially, psychologically. He never really recovered, but he still, was still a talent manager of a handful of stars who were loyal to him when they didn't have to be.
He said Jack Nicholson was giving him like an allowance.
Yeah, allowance? Well, he eventually, when we became friendly and he started trusting me with information, I'm like, how do you survive? Because he had no income, he had no pension or anything, and he didn't live well. I mean, when I first started taking him out, he was living in a converted garage in Van Nuys in a pretty rough neighborhood, and it was a pretty rough, seedy block, and the garage was pretty bleak and depressing. He didn't have any money, and what he had was, he said that, who was it? It was Jimmy Darren, who died last week. Oh my gosh, I should do an Instagram post about him because I've got some good audio interviews of him. He was the original Moondoggie in the Gidget TV series and movies, and a singing star. So Jimmy Darren, Jack Nicholson, Dick Van Dyke, Sally Kellerman, Valerie Harper. There was like a half dozen of these stars that even after Rudy stopped managing them and they moved on to, Jack Nicholson obviously could pick and choose who he wanted. They liked Rudy had something. You loved him and you hated him at the same time. He could be so fucking annoying and he could be really nasty. And then in the next minute, he'd be really loving and nice. And for me, he was a secret keeper and I wanted his secret. So I kept taking him out and getting information. But so he eventually, he hadn't spoken to Terry for about 20 years. And they used to be, as he called it, asshole buddies. That was the phrase that I think those guys used back then. And it's not homoerotic, although it sounds it. It just means that they're the very best friends if you're an asshole buddy. And Terry kind of broke his heart. And he told me once he became comfortable that he felt that he had shouldered all the responsibility for Manson killing everybody in his house when it was really Terry and Dennis and Greg Jacobson, who were his best friends, who were much more involved with Manson. He told Melcher that Manson wasn't allowed on the property anymore. He was one of the first people that kind of broke away from the official narrative and started telling me the truth.
In alleging that Charles Manson was much more involved with everybody than what's
and that
being
Bugliosi
said.
had changed that. And so once, I think you asked me how I got to Terry, once I started spending a lot of time with Rudy, I was still talking to Vince, mostly on the phone. Like I would check in with him once a week and run stuff by him. But then my questions were getting more and more kind of sensitive. Like, Rudy, or Vince, you wrote here that Terry had only met Manson this one time and that time. I didn't even tell him about the stuff after the murders because that was explosive, but just little things. And then I could tell Vince was getting nervous, and Vince started calling Rudy, which he shouldn't have, because then Rudy was saying, Vince is calling me. He's really upset with what you're asking. And then Vince started calling Terry. And
what exactly was it that you were asking that really shook Vince in his boots?
in the beginning, just that Terry had lied about his relationship with the family, and that Vince had allowed him to lie on the stand, which is, if that's called suborning perjury. If you know your witness is lying, then you're responsible for those lies. And the amazing thing is, in a death penalty case, if a witness testifies against a defendant who gets a death penalty, but it's shown that they're lying, committing perjury, they can be subjected to the same verdict. They can get a death penalty for lying if it gets somebody else a death penalty.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember how. I think Terry finally took my call because he called Rudy because he was worried about Rudy was telling me. And Rudy said, you better talk to him. I've told him a lot. And Terry didn't want to talk to me, but I think he knew he had no choice. And that kind of led to the few conversations I had with him.
Your interaction with him was one of those things where it was just like, oh my God, these guys are definitely guilty. Like he almost threw your notes off of his rooftop, right?
Well, he said he was going to.
Yeah.
He said, I could take those things, I'll throw them right now. He said, I also have the most powerful lawyers in Hollywood. I could shut you down. I mean, I got so many threats, not violent, mostly not threats of violence, but legal threats from people about their lawyers and what their lawyers were going to do to me.
Yeah.
And that was always a red flag. The minute they start talking about lawyers and suing, I know that I've caught them in something good.
Right. What was the significance? Like, why were they trying to downplay Terry Melcher's involvement? Like, so apparently he had only met Manson a few times, and it was said on the stand that, he hardly knew this guy. He turned him down. But I think it was Danny DiCarlo's interview with Bugliosi, which is funny because in Bugliosi's notes, he puts a big X over the entire paper. It's like, how could you
there's
make it
like
more
4
obvious?
or 5 pages of notes of Vince's interview with Danny. And I think I put most of them up on my Instagram and so people can see them for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, before one of his chief, well, I can't remember what the date was. He'd interview people a lot. And it was one of the early interviews with Danny. And almost everything in this 4 or 5 pages of Vince's notes, Danny testified to on the stand, except for the couple paragraphs that Vince crosses out, where he said Terry came to the ranch to see Manson in September after the murders, and A, B, and C happened. And then he says in the same interview, I next saw Terry out at Barker Ranch in middle of September after the family went there in early September. So that meant not only did Terry go to the Spahn Ranch, which was an hour from where he lived, and well, actually he was in Malibu, so maybe a half hour. But then he went to Barker Ranch, which is 6 hours, and then you have to get up to the top. I only went there for the first time a few years ago. That takes like 3 hours. It's impossible.
Yeah, I heard it's hard.
Oh, no, I take it back. Danny said he met him at the entrance to the pass. So Terry didn't go all the way up, but he drove into Death Valley. And then not only that, but Paul Watkins, who was another chief prosecution witness, didn't tell Vince this, or if he did, I don't have the notes, but he told one of the lead sheriff's investigators that he saw Terry the first week of September. And this is what's so frustrating. I started accessing these documents, which was fantastic because nobody had ever had them before. Law enforcement documents. These were sheriff's documents. And the notes are from Paul Watkins' interview, saw Terry at the ranch. I can't remember how it was dated, like the first week of September. Terry was on his knees begging for forgiveness. And Charlie was saying they had to all die. They're piggies. They had to die. And Terry was begging for forgiveness. Well, there's the cop's name at the top of the report. I immediately went to find him. I'm like, what am I missing here? Who had to be what? And he was dead. Jeez. And Paul Watkins was dead also before I even started this. So Terry was the only one I could ask about it. And of course, Terry denied that ever happened.
Yeah.
And DiCarlo, to this day, I think is alive, but
isn't he off the radar? Didn't he?
Yeah, he went to Mexico. I was able to get to him through ex-girlfriends, and all they would tell me was they had given my messages And if he wanted to call me, he would call me. There was nothing else they could do. They were in Texas. They said, right across the border in Mexico. And I just could never talk to him. And I don't think he'd ever talk to me anyway, but I tried. I did my, due diligence of trying to get these people to explain what I was going to put in my book.
Right. Well, and so it's like at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, well, if Melcher knew Manson far more than what's admitted in the book, Vincent Bugliosi is obviously lying about X, Y, and Z.
It's always, what else are they lying about?
Right.
Melcher was so important to Vince because Manson wasn't at the Tate house when the murders happened. The official narrative is Manson sent his followers to the former house of Terry Melcher to kill whoever they encountered for two reasons: to ignite Helter Skelter, to make the world think that the Panthers had committed these murders. That was like the A thread. The B thing was, and to instill fear in Terry Melcher. So for Bugliosi, and he writes, this isn't my reporting, this is him in his own book, for him to convince the people that Manson had selected this house and sent the killers there, he had to establish a relationship between Manson and the house. And the only relationship he had was Manson had dropped Terry off there once. Mm-hmm. And he knew that Terry had lived there. So he needed Terry to get up and testify about Manson dropping him off at the end of the driveway, but not coming into the house, but seeing where he lived, which was bullshit. I mean, I'm sure that happened, but he was there many times. But it could have been something as simple as Terry was filthy rich, and Terry said, I'll pay you all this money. I don't want the world to know how close I was to this person, how I might have, enabled him, whatever. Or it could have been something more sinister. I don't know. I mean, maybe Terry was involved in shit that was going on. That's what's so frustrating about the book, is there's so many questions I wasn't able to answer.
Yeah, but what I love that you state in the book is that you're not, I forgot exactly how it was worded. I wrote it
I know
down.
what you're going to say. It's probably where I wrote, I'm not able to answer what really happened. I can only show you that what you think happened didn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was hard for me to finally accept that, because my agent was telling me years before I finally stopped reporting. He goes, you're not going to get any more. You're not going to find that smoking gun. People are lying. They're dead. I'm like, no, give me more time. And I would find more stuff, but it was never enough. And finally he said, you can show that everything people think they know about the case is wrong. That's enough. He said, do a second book after if you want. And I'm like, Are you kidding? Not in a million years. And then look at me now.
Right. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that it pretty much just started out as like, okay, people are lying. And then it went into, a completely different rabbit hole.
And so many of them aren't even in the book.
But all of them tie together.
But not the ones that didn't end up in the book. I mean, they might tie together. I'm still looking into them for the second book, but there were so many leads I had that were tantalizingly close to explaining stuff, but then they wouldn't. And then I couldn't include them in the book because it would confuse. I just had to, that's why I got the gift of the collaborator I had who helped me so much, because I completely lost perspective after too many years and too much obsession about what really mattered and what didn't. And I had this young guy come in and is like, that's not important. That's get that. And luckily I trusted him and he was right most of the time. We never had a fight. We had a couple disagreements, but there's nothing in there that I regret keeping out. Well, I shouldn't say I wish I could have had another 200 pages.
Yeah, right.
But
yeah, the cast of characters would have been nice. So when you first met up with Rudy, did Vince get you in contact with him, or did you?
No. Vince did not want me to. He said, "Don't even try him. He doesn't do interviews."
Right. And so how did you end up talking to him?
I had pretty good resources back then, but not as great as they became when I learned how to find people on my own.
Was it skip tracing?
All that kind of stuff, yeah. And hiring a retired cop.
I like that his name was Moon.
Moon Mullen, yeah.
Almost like he was a part of the Manson family himself.
He was at the raid, the August 16th raid. He was in the sheriff's department.
Wow.
Which was amazing. And I was worried about his reaction to my book because I'm writing about his colleagues. And he's part of, the, whatever you call it, the Retired Sheriff's Association. He goes to the reunions. He lives in Oh no, it's Arizona, not Nevada. I've never met him face to face. I mean, the guy helped me so much, and he was good with the book. He didn't tell me he was upset by it. I sent him a copy when it came out, and he still helps me when I need it from time to time. But I'd have to look it up. Somebody must have gotten me his number, and I never thought he'd talk to me. But the first conversation we had, I think he'd had a few drinks and a couple of pills, and he was really loose and inappropriate and flirtatious. And he finally said if I took him out to, this is a crazy story. I can't remember if it's in the book. If I took him to Musso and Frank's, and bought him lunch, he'd talk to me, and then later he'd decide whether I could use it on the record, which is a start for me. You don't turn that down if it's somebody as important as him. So I took him to Musso and Frank's, and had a great interview. He let me take the tape recorder out, and he didn't tell me all the really important stuff, but he kind of laid the groundwork. And then I got the feeling like this is going to continue for a few weeks. I had no idea it was going to be years of these meals. But that day, driving home, he got in a car accident and was almost killed. And he called me from the hospital. I think he was only kept in overnight. And he said, because I talked to you, they tried to kill me. And he goes, that makes me more determined to talk to you. He said he got run off the road. I don't know if it's true. I know that he drank quite a few drinks at the lunch and probably shouldn't have been driving. I probably should have tried to stop it. Mm-hmm. But I also knew that he was accustomed to driving that way. And he never got a car again after that accident. So that was worse for me, but better for him. It meant he wasn't going to get in an accident again. But from then on, every meal we had, I was telling you about this last night, I had to drive from Venice to Van Nuys to pick him up. And it was always rush hour, because rush hour in LA is like 3 to 8. So, an hour trip, 45 minutes to an hour trip would be anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours just to get him. Then I'd have to drive him back to Hollywood, which could be another half hour to 45 minutes. Take him to a restaurant, which would be an hour or two.
As a young journalist, this has to be exhilarating for you. I mean, you're driving around with the owner of Cielo.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy because I knew how important he was, but I also knew he was playing me. I knew that he was only really, he kept saying to me, you're never going to catch me in a lie, but you might not always get the full story. And I knew what he was doing. He wanted to stretch it out because he was a lonely old man. Oh, that's what I started to say a few minutes ago about luck and timing. When I reached out to him, it was 99. People had stopped trying to interview him years before. It was an old story. I think I got him at a vulnerable time in his life. He had nothing going on. He was drinking a lot, probably really lonely. And he learned that when he talked to me, I could see it in his face, just talking about the parties he had at the house, the friends he had, everything up until the murders. He was on top of the world. I mean, he had such an amazing life. At that point, he was representing Henry Fonda, Sally Kellerman, Jack Nicholson, Dick Van Dyke, big Hollywood stars, and then being invited everywhere. Everything crashed down after the murders. But when he would talk to me about the old times, I could see him reliving it, and he loved it. And then he's got some young guy who I think he thought was handsome, although he never liked the way I dressed. I was never, because I'm not a good gay. I was always sloppy, and my car was dirty, and my car was like falling apart. He would mock the hell out of me. But that was part of our relationship. He was a Brooklyn Italian guy, left home when he was like 14 because he was gay and, wasn't going to hide it from his family in the 40s, I think it was. Yeah, because I think he fought in the war. It had to have been the Korean War. Moved to Hollywood. No, it must have been World War II. I think he was born in the teens. Yeah, he lied about his age. That's how he got out of it. I think he lied to get into World War II. I think he went when he was like 15 or 16. And right after he got out, he got the GI Bill, went to Hollywood, worked as a waiter or maitre d', and started networking with the Hollywood stars. He was actually working at Musso and Frank's and other places, and then became a talent manager. Lived in on Cherokee Avenue in Hollywood in the same building as Elizabeth Short. You know who she is?
She was, Black Dahlia.
Black Dahlia. He knew her. They lived in the same building.
Wow.
when she was killed. So he was like a repository of old Hollywood lore. But it was really hard work, and exhausting. Every night, I mean, probably the first 6 months, I would take him out at least, maybe not once a week, but at least once every other week. And that was like a 6-hour investment, 2 hours driving each way. It was more than 6 hours, 2 hours at the restaurant having dinner, and then taking him on errands on the way home, pick up his dry cleaning, take him to the supermarket, and then he'd want me to come in the house and talk more and drink more, and I'd be exhausted. I'd get home at 1 or 2, and I shouldn't have been driving. But yeah, I have hours and hours of audio. Oh, no, I actually stopped taping him after a few months because he would also talk about stuff that was so disconnect. I mean, it was fascinating. I probably should have taped everything. But at that point, I was transcribing everything. It would take forever, so I would just take notes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the strongest parts about one of your hangouts with him, I loved it. It was when you were talking about you guys drove up Cielo Drive. And
oh, that was amazing.
You guys just kind of sat there in silence for a second, and he was like, the view was so nice.
And then he started crying. Or I thought he was having a heart attack. So we had gone out to dinner with Elaine Young, this other classic Hollywood character. She was a real estate agent who had the worst plastic surgery. I mean, so bad that she became a celebrity because of her bad facelifts. Mm-hmm. She'd go on Oprah and tell people not to get facelifts and say, look at me. And her face was all distorted and she had a blonde wig and she was the sweetest lady in the world. But she was the realtor who rented Rudy's house to Sharon and Roman. She sold OJ his house. She rented or sold Nicole Simpson her house. Her first or second husband was Gig Young, who shot and killed himself in their house. There were like 7 or 8 deaths, violent deaths in houses that she was responsible.
Wow.
And I would say, Elaine, why, I would never buy a house from you because I'm going to die there.
Yeah.
And she goes, I often thought of having that as my tagline on my business card. You're risking your life, but you'll get a beautiful house.
Beware.
But so she and I had taken her out to dinner with Rudy for her birthday. I think we went to Dan Tana's that night. Then we took her home, and I would go up Coldwater Canyon to take Rudy home. And this one night I said, you want to go up, is it Coldwater that Cielo's off? See, I can't even remember anymore. But I said, you want to go up to the house? And he said, I haven't been there. So he sold it, I think, in the early 90s, I think to Trent Reznor. Mm-hmm. And then I think Trent Reznor sold it to the guy who ended up tearing it down. And he hadn't been back, I think, since he moved out, even to look at it. So it didn't exist anymore. It had been torn down, and there was this ugly, massive building where it was. And for whatever reason, he said, yeah, we'll go up there. And we went up to the cul-de-sac, to the end, and we looked at the gates. And he just started saying, he goes, that's not the address. I go, no, Rudy, you knew they changed the number. He goes, I know, but they shouldn't have changed the number. Those gates are ugly, and you could only see like part of it.
And he was still referencing it like, where's my mailbox?
Yeah, where's my mailbox? And and then all of a sudden he just started, he said something about how beautiful the view was. And then he started like hyperventilating. I'm like, what, are you all right? He goes, get out, go. I'm like, what? He goes, just get the fuck out or get the hell out. And I drove away and he was crying. He had this emotional reaction. And we went back that night to his house. And that night I went in because I was a little worried about him. And that was one of the first times he really started talking to me about Terry. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in the book. He started saying, those motherfuckers set me up to be the fall guy. He goes, they've gotten away with it. They had no recriminations. And Terry was still alive then, and Terry wasn't talking to him. And he was furious that Terry wouldn't talk to him. But I think, it worked to my benefit that I brought him up there because I think it kind of unsealed the cap a little bit that made him more forthcoming and telling me more stuff.
And it was Out to Belly that brought it to you that Melcher was a lot more connected to Manson.
He was the first one, and I didn't believe him at first. I thought he was exaggerating and stuff. And that's when I started chasing down the case files. And I found out this homicide detective from the LAPD had either stolen or copied the entire Tate homicide. He was the sergeant under the commander, a guy named Mike McGann. He's in the book. I write about it. He tried to sell it to me for a couple $100,000. I said, I can't. So I flew out to Utah. I forget the name of this, one of those exclusive communities. He lived next door to Demi Moore and Bruce Willis when they were married. That's how long ago it was, because they were, and in this beautiful house.
I didn't know cops made that much money.
Exactly. So I flew out to see him, and that was the first time he didn't let me look at anything, but he took out some of the important interviews and he sat there and read to me from them. I said, just show me so I can just make sure you're not, I have to, Mike. So he'd hold it up and I just look for, and then he'd put it down. And then a couple years later, and again, it's about people feeling bored and they're retired. He left Utah with his wife and they got a place in Palm Desert or Palm Springs, outside of Palm Springs. You might like this because you might like this guy's movies. Do you know who Russ Myers was?
Yes.
Yeah. He was like a softcore porn director in the 60s. And he did these really cheesy B movies like Valley of the Vixens with these women with massive breasts. He was kind of like John Carpenter for porn in the 60s.
That's a title right there.
Yeah, and he had a really weird sex house, and Mike and Elsa, his wife, bought it, and they kind of kept the decor like Russ Meyer had it. So I started going there to see him in the early 2000s, and eventually we reached a deal, which was he wanted to write a book, a memoir, and he had boxes and boxes of these files, and he said, if you organize everything and create like an index and filing system, you can photocopy and take whatever you want, which was amazing. And I said, all right. So luckily I had a friend that lived in Palm Springs, an ex-LA Times reporter, and I went and stayed at her house for like 2 weeks, went to Mike and Elsa's every day, and I'd go into the garage and just go through everything, create these hanging folders and these cartons, and then take stuff to Kinko's, copy it, bring it back. But the problem was every day, like clockwork, at like noon or 11:30, he'd come into the garage and goes, we're going to lunch. I'm like, Mike, I want to get through it. He goes, no, you got to come to lunch with Elsa and I. And they'd pay for it, but I had to drink with them. And they had like a 5-martini lunch every day, and we get rip-roaring drunk. And I go back, and it was really hard to work because I'd be drunk, and then he'd come in there and just start talking to me and telling me stories. So it took longer than the original week or two, but I got everything from him. And then I'd find out that what Rudy and other people were telling me that hadn't been reported, I'd find the copies of their interviews that nobody had seen before where they said the same thing to the police.
And now the question becomes, why wasn't it reported? Why was this redacted or entirely?
Yeah, that's the thing. So Vince said, and it's in my book, when we had our big kind of climactic meeting in 2006 or 7, 7 or 8 years later, my agent wouldn't let me do my real hard interview with him where I asked him, through all of my evidence of his corruption in front of him until I got my book deal. He said, he's too powerful and too dangerous. The minute he finds out what you have on him, he will contact every publisher and you're never going to get a deal. So I said, but I need to know his response because that'll, make it a better book if we're taking it. He goes, no, trust me. And my agent was right. So, but I did get a book deal and a good one in 2005, I think. So in 2006, I got in touch with Vince, and that's a crazy story, but it's in the book about how he pretended he didn't know who I was or it didn't remember. All lies. We met, and it was like another full day at his house, like 6, 7, 8 hours, where I was putting all these documents in his own handwriting. And he asked what you just asked, like, even if it was that, well, where does it all go? Why is it important? I said, I don't know, Vince. That's what I'm here to find out from you. Why did you lie about Terry? I didn't say I lied. I go, look at your handwriting. He goes, well, and that's where it got crazy. He would say, he wouldn't answer. It was such an exercise in futility. But he would then start threatening me. I mean, that's one of the frustrating things. I could never find out what the end game was. And Vince, that's what I was going to say. Vince kept repeating, well, where does it all go? what if? So if you say I did, why, to what end? And I say, Vince, I know there's an end. I know there's a reason. What's the reason? You're the only one who knows. And now Terry was dead at that point. No, he wasn't dead. Yeah, he was still alive. But neither,
Well, I love that. That's one of my favorite parts of your book is when you meet up with Terry on his rooftop. I don't know why. It was just such a visual chapter for me. I mean, I almost felt like I was there. And, his reaction to your questions were quite sketchy. And the fact that he tried to coerce you out of doing your book to do his own book. And it was just this big, weird situation.
Yeah, that's one thing I wish I had more in the book about that. Dan wanted me to reduce some of that interview stuff. And I was really shocked recently that somebody told me it's not in the book, where Terry says to me, I think it's in the book where he says, you can do my memoir. But I don't think it's in the book where he adds, people don't know the truth about my mother. I think I've said that story on podcasts, and people have heard me talk about that on podcasts.
And his mom's Doris Day.
Doris Day. And he goes, people don't know about, I could tell you stories about her and Frank and her and Sammy, the Rat Pack, who she traveled with. And the implication was not nice stories about my mom and them. He was going to throw her, under the water or out the whatever, however the cliche is.
It was like bribery at this point.
Oh, yeah. He was trying, yeah. And I said to him, I go, wait, you've never written your memoirs. I can understand why any publisher would pay you a fortune, but why would you ask the person who now is confronting you with all of the lies you've told about probably the thing you're known best for better or worse in your life, for being an important part of this famous murders case, and I'm showing that you're lying, and you're asking me to be I'm not going to trust anything you say to me.
Yeah.
He was so out of touch with reality. But then again, he was raised in a very privileged world. His mother was, and God knows you and I might have become the same kind of person, when you've got everything you want in your life in Beverly Hills. Your mother's the #1 movie star for like 10 or 15 years. And you do have to give him credit. He was a talented music producer by all accounts. He was really good at that. So it wasn't like he was a Nepo baby who got where he got just because of his connections. He had an innate talent for music producing, but he was a dick. And, I found out stories about him that aren't in the book. Silly stuff, but just like, he and Jacobson and Wilson, when they were the Golden Penetrators, would take guns out and shoot up street lamps and cars, headlights and stuff. And the cops always let them go because of who they were and because of his mother.
When you're talking to like ex-celebrities of the 60s, like Melcher and, Altobelli, he wasn't necessarily a celebrity, but in the 60s, he was a lot more important than when you met with him. How easy was it for you to separate lies and truth? Like,
it was impossible half the time.
Was there a piece of you that felt like maybe these guys are just irrelevant now and they're doing whatever they can to be relevant?
Yeah. No, that was, I think I wrote about that in the book. Every time people told me something that was new, that contradicted the official record, I wouldn't believe it. I would use it as a possibility, but then I'm like, I have to find corroboration. Because they might be doing this for a couple of reasons. Number one, because they're trying to make themselves more important than they were, and they want to please the interviewer. They want to just exaggerate, embellish their role, and not just celebrities, but cops and lawyers would tell me stuff that I knew couldn't have been true. Because I actually had the official records. They would put themselves in situations like, oh, I was at the Tate house the day the murders happened. I was part of the evidence. But they weren't, because I have the list of who was there. And I think a lot of it wasn't even deliberate half the time. They would hear so many stories, read the books, watch the movies. And since they were peripherally part of it, they'd kind of think in their memory that they were actually there for it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that many people outright lied, except the people that were really protecting themselves, for the wrong reasons.
Right.
But I would always, my agent said to my first publisher, Penguin, when they bought the book, after they bought it, we had like this celebratory meeting at the Penguin offices, myself and Sloan, Ann and Scott, the two people at Penguin who bought it. And Sloan said, this would have happened a lot sooner. Ironically, in 2005, he thought, all right, the book's going to be out in 2007, and it shouldn't have taken 8 years. It ends up taking 20 years. But he said it would have happened sooner, except to Tom's detriment. But also, I think what makes this such an important book is whenever he finds out anything new, he has to disprove the possibility of it being wrong first before he'll believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, that's why it took so long.
Yeah.
And I think that was right.
What was the revelation that you got from Melcher? I mean,
he didn't admit to anything to me.
Yeah, but what was there something that you left the meeting with him on? Was it just the fact that he was so offended you knew he had to have been lying?
Yeah, and it was the lengths he went to appease me, to like you already brought up. First, to threaten me about throwing my shit off his roof. An innocent person doesn't do that, to threaten me with all the lawyers, and then to say, I'm going to throw my mother under the bus. I'll give you all her secrets for a book that we'll do together if you don't do this one. Mm-hmm. So then you've got him. I caught him in easier lies to prove, like he said that he hadn't talked to Vince for, I think, 15 years. And Vince told me the same thing, but later Vince slipped a couple times and said, well, I talked to Terry 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, I don't know, Vince, you told me you hadn't talked to him. And the two of them slipped a couple times. So I knew they were communicating about what I was talking to them about. And then Rudy would tell me the same thing, that, Terry would call him and say he had just gotten off the phone with Vince. And I'm like, both of them say they don't talk, and they haven't. And Rudy's like, they're lying. They're lying to you.
Right. And now, at what point did everything start to flip on its head? Was it when you had learned about the 1967 Summer of Love and Haight-Ashbury? Or
I was trying to figure out why they were all lying. I'm like, who are they protecting and why are they protecting? What could be? And that's when, I started thinking, I can't even remember now the chronology of how A led to B, led to D, led to E and F.
Yeah.
But one door would open another door. And then one of the watershed moments was when I finally got access to Manson's federal parole file.
Which was very difficult to get, right?
Yeah, it took about 1.5 years. And then I only got it in smatterings and with a lot of redactions. And then I'd appeal the redactions. I mean, the whole process took about 2 or 3 years. And I still haven't gotten the whole thing. I mean, I stopped trying a long time ago, but there's still stuff that's withheld. But then I started seeing that he had all this leniency and that he should have been violated and sent back to prison within 6 months of his release, and all these anomalies in his parole supervision.
And what was he on parole for at the time?
He had been released. This is what's so crazy. He went to prison in 1960 for violating parole for a charge of forging a $37 check. So he was in prison for 8 years for that, and federal prison. So when he was out on parole, it was for that. I mean, there were so many prior convictions and charges that they all kind of were rolled into bigger and bigger sentences.
But it was because it was federal, right? Like
because
if it was on a local level.
He was never charged with anything local. I mean, he was charged, but he was never convicted. Vince said in the book, he said, at one point in the book, he said, one of the most amazing things about Manson's career as a criminal is every conviction has been federal. He's never served time in what they call a jail. When you're in like the county jail or something, but you're on a federal charge, they're just holding you until the process is done. If you get sentenced, you go to federal prison, which is much harder than a state jail. And he was always in federal institutions. And, I think that's important in the end because he was in federal institutions from the time he was about 13 when he was getting sent to juvenile detention centers and, supervised living centers, always federal, which is where, if we get back to MK Ultra, where the government was doing research and experimenting with adolescent boys. I can't talk about too much of that now because that is some of my new reporting that's going to be in the second book about a parallel track of where these research experiments took place and when, and where Manson was kind of in the same route.
So his parole officer essentially kept excusing it keeping him out of jail.
Even trying to send him to Mexico.
Yeah.
Where he'd have no supervision and where he was last, taken into custody. So in 1960, he was a fugitive and he was picked up in Mexico and brought by the federales to the Texas, I guess the FBI in Texas took custody of him, transported him back to Los Angeles, and then he was sent to prison from 60 to 67. So the last place of his freedom was in Mexico. He hadn't been free. So he's out of prison for 2 or 3 months, and Roger Smith is writing to his bosses in Washington saying Manson wants to go to Mazatlan. He has a job playing, music in a hotel in Mexico. Can we send him there for a year? Mm-hmm. Not if you're supposedly rehabilitating him and supervising him, because you're just cutting him loose in the country that he got into trouble. We still don't know what happened in Mexico. He later claimed at parole hearings and to interviews in his senior years, starting like 10 or 15 years before he died, that he had killed people in Mexico. And that's why he was deported. And who knows with Manson, he throws out all these red herrings, whether it's true or not. But, and then he was turned down, Smith, by the supervisors. They said, "Are you crazy? This guy has just gotten out of prison. You can't send him to a foreign country where he was last picked up and deported from." And then 2 or 3 months later, Smith again asked them to send him to a different part of Mexico with Dean Morehouse, who's on probation at that time. Manson, as a parolee, isn't allowed to associate with criminals, especially somebody who's also on probation. Roger wants the two of them to go to Mexico and do soil research for an engineering company that I think might have been a cover for CIA stuff, but I don't have that in the book because I couldn't prove it. And they said again, no, you can't send this guy. And of course, when I asked Roger about this, he denied ever writing these letters. And it wasn't until I showed him the letters, he goes, "Oh, I guess I did." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, I don't remember writing them." I said, "Hypothetically, like in what world would it be good for Manson?" He goes, "I honestly have no idea." And, again, so I'm sitting across from him thinking, is he lying to me now? Does he not remember? And I know I forget a lot of shit. I've probably forgotten facts and stuff talking to you. But then still, he needs to, there must have been a reason. I mean, you don't send people to another country for a job that he could be doing in the Bay Area, playing guitar at a coffee shop. Why send him?
Well, what the excuse could have been is that he's a parole officer, so he's got multiple clients, and maybe
didn't
he
have a lot of.
once.
Manson was also in a special program called the San Francisco Project, where the project was designed to evaluate their predisposition to violating parole, which is ironic considering that's what he was doing. And it was a study of recidivism. And Manson was part of that project. Nobody's ever reported that till I did. And Roger was part of that project. I still don't know the secrets of that project. It was a federal project sponsored by the government. I write about it in the book, but it's another thing that, I feel like a dummy talking about it because it's another admission of mine that I couldn't figure out what it all meant. But the fact that it was hidden and that it should have meant that Manson was even more supervised and more kind of monitored.
Well, it was said that Roger Smith had like 20 clients and then he whittled it down to 10 and then it was 5 and then it was just Manson.
Yeah.
So he had one client while he was essentially giving him, as you say, the get out of jail free card.
And then also starting his own drug research program out of the same clinic that Charlie West was at, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic.
And David Smith, founder, correct?
Yeah.
Jesus. Okay, so this is where I feel like in the book, the rabbit hole starts to get crazy because you start looking into his parole officer. You start noticing this trend of like Manson clearly needing to be sent back to jail, but he keeps getting this get out of jail free card. And that was through Roger Smith.
And it escalated in Los Angeles. So Roger was actually taken off Manson's case by his supervisors in the late spring of 68. They wrote to him and said, "You're to have nothing to do with him anymore." Then he got a new parole officer in L.A. who had even less to do with him. Manson in L.A. in the months leading up to the murder and a few weeks after was charged twice with statutory rape, car theft. Then they had the massive raid at the ranch where they arrested 33 of them a week to the day after the Tate LaBianca murders. And they found guns, stolen vehicles, underage girls, drugs. Manson had stolen credit cards in his pocket. Vince doesn't report any of this.
He also doesn't report that it was the biggest raid in Southern California history.
In the history until the Patty Hearst kidnapping, when the LAPD believed that Patty was holed up in a house in South Central Los Angeles in like 75 or something. And they had this massive SWAT team raid where they surrounded it. They ended up exploding the house. And I think 5 or 6 Symbionese Liberation Army people, her captors, were incinerated, including Donald DeFreeze, who was the leader, but Patty wasn't there. Until that raid, the Manson raid was the biggest in the history of the state of California. Vince gives it like one paragraph in the book and doesn't write anything about it. I mean, Manson should have been immediately sent back to prison. You know, he
and what was it, 3 days?
3 days, they were all released. And he was identified in the search warrant, which was like 20 pages, as the criminal leader of this underage crime ring that were also working as prostitutes. They had a machine gun. And he's not allowed to be around firearms. There's also ex-cons that were arrested with him. There were so many different violations. And then a week after that, he was arrested again on drug charges and contributing to the delinquency of a minor when this cabin on the adjacent ranch to the Spahn Ranch was raided by the cops, and he was with a 15-year-old girl, Stephanie Schramm.
But they kept releasing him.
Kept releasing him, yeah.
Now, when it came to Roger Smith, was it him who was doing the experiments with LSD, with mice, or was that David Smith?
That was David Smith. Roger was doing what was called the Amphetamine Research Project. So he was studying Roger did undergrad, I think at University of Chicago. I think he got his master's there. Then he went to Berkeley. They had a school of criminology at Berkeley that closed, I think, in the early 70s. So he was getting his PhD or his master's, I forget, in criminology. And his focus of research was on gangs and adolescent gangs. And, in the Bay Area, there were, the Black Panthers were just forming. So he was looking at youth gangs who were prone to violence, who were using drugs, what role drugs played in kids joining the gangs and then becoming violent. This is while Manson was creating his criminal gang family. And then David Smith asked him to study amphetamines.
Now, David Smith is the
no
founder,
relation. Yeah, he's the founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic.
Which was, let's just break that down for people who don't know.
It was opened in June of 1967 in anticipation of this influx of runaways and hippie kids to the San Francisco for the Summer of Love, which happened. David saw it coming like 6 months before. I don't know how he saw it coming. I don't know how he saw the whole communal life hadn't happened yet, but David was researching the role of drugs in aggregate settings when he did his mice studies, and it's complicated and scientific. I think I laid it out pretty well in the book.
Well, let's get into that real quick, because the mice studies quite literally reflects what the Manson family was. There was this specific, I forgot what it was called, but
behavioral sync.
There was a mouse that would pretty much destroy other mice until the alpha would walk around.
No, so when they aggregated, what's so fucking crazy about this. So David would call them mice, and then he would interchange them and say they were rats. And not just in his interviews with me, but in books and articles. He'd talk about the same specific research he did, but he would vary the animals. And I would talk to people who work in medical research, and I'd say, can you just interchange when you're discussing this stuff, rats and mice? And they say, no, they have very different genetic makeups. And there are many different breeds of rats and breeds of mice. And you use, for someone to just blanketly say they're using one animal for this research and then change the breed to another, it doesn't, they didn't say this, but it sounds like they're doing other research that they're not publicizing and they're mixing it up.
Right.
So the mice, I just like to say mice rat research that he was supposed to get his master's degree for, but he never did his thesis, was on mice in aggregate settings. So he would put mice in communal settings, and after a while, what do you call it? An alpha mouse, but they call it a rat. Let's call it rats again. Like a master rat would emerge, and the male rats would be frightened of him, and the female rats would become his harem, and the male rats would sometimes go out and slaughter other rats and bring the limbs and blood back. I mean, it was like a role, like a model for the Manson family. It was crazy.
Literally.
And David did this in 65 and 66. And then he foresaw this influx of hippies and LSD and youth coming to the Haight. And he opened this clinic to treat them, give them free medical care. Love means care or whatever.
And they were giving grants from the government.
Yeah.
And you can't just get money for free.
Yeah, you're supposed to, the grants were, he said that he didn't get grants from the government. He said and I interviewed him. I went and met with him after my book came out this past July, and he didn't want to meet with me. He was really angry, but I persuaded him to sit down with me for 2 or 3 hours. It was a very interesting conversation. He let me tape the whole thing. That'll be in part 2. I'm not hiding anything. There's no big admissions, but there's not yet. Yeah, but there's stuff that he said that's very important. Anyway, he in his book, he wrote a book about the clinic called Love Needs Care that was published in 72 or 73. And he talks about the fact that he had this kind of foresight into what was about, like he could see the future. I mean, was that innocent or was the future scripted, you know? And then that's exactly what happened in his mice studies, happened in the Haight. All of a sudden kids started living communally and violence started happening and the drugs started antagonizing and accelerating the violence. Now, he introduced drugs into his mice studies in 65, where he would inject them with amphetamines and see if that calmed them down or accelerated, and usually it accelerated the violence. Then he would give them LSD and different kinds of drugs to see, he said it in one of his papers, if they could control the behavior of the mice in the aggregate settings. I still feel like there's so much more to be done on this.
Well, and this is the fucking mind-blowing part, is this is in 65, 66, you said. Manson goes to...
67.
In 67.
Yeah. And then goes right into the belly of the beast, starts bringing his girls to the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic.
And wasn't Abigail Folger's mom like a donator of the Haight-Ashbury?
She funded it, and she worked as a receptionist.
Is there something connecting that, or is that just a coincidence?
Well, there was a party, a fundraiser in the spring of 68 or 69 that the Folgers threw for the clinic, that Roger Smith was at, Abigail was at, Wojciech was at, Jay Sebring, Sharon Tate, and Colonel Tate, and Mrs. Tate.
So Manson's parole officer was in the same room as some of the victims who were murdered by Manson.
Yeah. And Roger told me that when he found out about the murders, not when he found out about the murders, when he found out that Manson had been arrested for the murders December 1st of 69, his first thought was about Abigail's mother, because he had known the mother through the clinic. David said the same thing. He said, I met Abigail because Inez, her mother, brought her to the clinic. She was worried about her drug use. She was volunteering. So, but in Ed Sanders' book, he reports that he had it on good authority that Manson and several of his followers were at the Folgers party. that everybody else was at, Sharon and everyone. This is like 6 or 7 months before the murders.
You're talking about at CLO with Billy Doyle?
No. This was at the Folgers house in San Francisco when they had the fundraising party. He wrote it in The Family in his book. Unfortunately, I can't tell you yet what David said to me about that when I asked him about that and what Roger said. And I'll tell you off the record, it's not, they didn't say, oh yeah, we were. They both denied it, but not in persuasive ways.
Well, shit, when Chaos 2 comes out, we'll do another
one.
And we'll talk all about it.
Hopefully we'll both be alive. Not because anyone's going to kill us, but because we're both going to be 30 years older.
Yeah, it'll take another 20, 30 years.
No, it can't.
Was it basically that you found out that Roger Smith was giving Manson all of this leniency in jail? You start looking into Roger Smith. You find out he's working with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. That's how you find David Smith.
Once I got Manson's parole file, Roger is mentioned once in Helter Skelter. David's mentioned once or twice, just as David ran the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic and had this to say about, drugs and youth. It wasn't about anything important. But when I got Manson's parole file and I saw what had happened that first year in the Haight and his very unusual relationship with his parole officer, Roger, I thought, what really went on in the Haight? Because Vince goes through that. The book is very detailed, but Manson's time in the Haight, when he basically turned into the Charles Manson, the monster we know, when all of a sudden he got this power, it's an unreported chapter of his life. Nobody really knows. So that's when I started going up to San Francisco to try to find out from people who were at the clinic and who knew Roger. This is before Roger agreed to talk to me. David did agree to talk to me early on. I thought there was stuff going on up there that hadn't been explored, and I wanted to look into it. So...
And you went in there and asked people who worked there, have you ever seen?
Oh yeah, I interviewed just about everybody I could find that was on staff there from 1967 till 68.
Right.
And I got, Ernest Sternberg, who was the head of the psychiatry office there, and probably a half dozen doctors, a half dozen nurses, and then 10 or more medical volunteers. A lot of people would work there one day a week. Some people were on full-time staff. And it was it's still an untold story, I think.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to find out, how would he be important enough to these people that they would enable him and protect him and treat him special, What could he have done for them? And that's when I started finding out about the kind of research that was being done for MK Ultra, and that Jolly West was at that clinic doing that research at the same time. And then I started exploring what was MK Ultra, because I also wanted to know, and actually this was very early, how did Manson learn to control these people like this? And I've said this in other interviews. People always say, why do you think people are so fascinated by Manson and these murders when there have been so many other murders before and since? I said, it's one simple answer. It's because he got these kids, some of them as young as 18, 19, 20 years old, and under a year for most of them to go out and do whatever he said without question, including killing absolute strangers.
I think in your book you said they went from flowers in their hair to knives in their...
Yeah. How did he do that? And this guy was supposedly illiterate. He had a reading level of fourth grade, had spent most of his life in prison or in federal institutions. How did that happen in 1 year? And then when I found out that the CIA was trying to do that for 20 years with unlimited money and unlimited researchers and research subjects, and said they couldn't do it, but here's Manson, who gets out of prison and has this kind of special relationship with the law, at the same time becoming exactly what the CIA was trying to learn how to do and create. And I have to be careful. I don't think that anybody wanted Manson to do what he did. And it's still a theory, but I think what he did is likely a casualty of them playing, experimenting with him and his followers.
So you think it was a mind control operation gone wrong?
Yeah, and I have a quote in the book. So Alan Shefflin, who wrote one of the best books, but it's impossible to find, it's called The Mind Manipulators. After the search for the John Marks book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, came out, a year or two later, Alan Shefflin, who I think is still alive, and he's a law professor at Hastings College. I think that's where he was before. He was a medical doctor and a lawyer. He wrote a book called The Mind Manipulators about the same subject, MK Ultra, what was done, what wasn't done. And it's very academic. It's very thick. It's hard reading. But I met with him when I started going up to San Francisco. He was up there, and showed him, most of my findings and what I'd found out about Smith's relationship with Roger, with David, and also about the role of Jolly in all of this. And I said, do you think it's possible that this was an MK Ultra experiment gone wrong? And he didn't even hesitate. He said, I think it was possible, or he said, I think it was likely it was an MK Ultra experiment gone right. I don't know,
Well, I mean, fuck, those two things change the context so much, because it's like if it was gone right, I mean, you look at what Chaos and COINTELPRO was set out to do, and it's like mission accomplished with Charles Manson.
I know.
But if it were, gone wrong, it would make sense too, because I think those operations ended only a couple years after the murders.
If they ended, though.
If they ended,
that's what we don't know. Yeah,
that's the big question.
That's another thing. I have no idea whether it actually did end.
Yeah.
I don't think that they, and again, this is all speculative. So Jolly West reported to his CIA handlers in 1955 that he had created the technology using hypnosis and drugs to successfully remove true memories from a subject, replace them with false memories without that person knowing.
Well, let's rewind for a second. So I want to get into who Jolly West is, but more importantly, out of the Smiths, how did you get to Jolly West?
That's funny, because when Dan and I were writing the book, he said it's really important that we're able to find the moment where all of a sudden Jolly West came into this story. And I said, I'm not sure, and I have to look. So I dug deep into all my interview notes, and luckily I save everything. And I traced it back to a meeting I had with this crazy guy who was an ex-FBI agent named... oh God, now his name's escaping me. He's well known in the conspiracy world. He kind of, depending on what your perspective is, either lost his mind or was controlled by his former employers at the FBI. He was the head of the LA field office for the FBI, Ted Gunderson. If you look him up, you'll go down 1,000 rabbit holes. So I had met with him in about 2000 to ask him about something related to, about the FBI and COINTELPRO in Los Angeles. And while we were talking, I went, he was speaking somewhere, and after his speech, I took him to dinner, and he said to me in the dinner, and I had it in my notes, because I talked to him, I said, one of the biggest mysteries to me is how Manson learned how to control his followers. And I said, it seemed like all that happened in the hate at the same time that he should have been violated and his parole officer wasn't.
When he was in jail half of his adult life.
And Gunderson said, and I said, I knew he was going to the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic for care. And he said, would you know who Jolly West is? And I said, I do. Why? And then I go, oh, I interviewed him. And he goes, you interviewed Jolly West? I go, yeah, probably 5 or 6 years ago. I did a story on celebrity stalkers. He was an expert. He was a chairman of the psychiatry department and director of the neuroscience at UCLA. And I went to his office, had a stupid meeting with him where I didn't even transcribe it because he was arrogant and he just lectured. There was no cue. I couldn't ask him any questions. And so I had forgotten about him. And I said, no, what would Jolly West have to do with it? He goes, well, he worked for the CIA in their brainwashing program called MK Ultra. I had never heard of MK Ultra until that day. And I didn't know that Jolly West had been alleged to be part of it. I didn't even remember who he was, except that I had interviewed him 5 years before for an hour. And And he said he was also at the clinic recruiting people for his research. And I said, so he explained to me that MK Ultra's ultimate objective was to create programmed assassins. And he didn't even put that together with Manson. He just said, it's interesting that you're curious about that and you found out this new information about the leniency. In other words, Manson was more valuable to somebody outside of prison than inside. Why was that? He goes, you should look into Jolly West in the clinic. And that's when I went back, and I was barely online. I think there was a little bit you could find online. And there were allegations that West had been a part of this program, but he denied them. I also found out he had died about a year before, or 2 years before, 98, I think. So I couldn't interview him. But the first thing I did was, when I saw these allegations, and I saw he was on the front page of the New York Times in the very first story about MK Ultra, written by Seymour Hersh, famous investigative reporter, showing that the government had this secret brainwashing program. And he said there were so many institutions that were contracted, and these academics and scientists who were hired, subcontracted to do work. And West was one of like a dozen named on the front page of the Times. In the same story, West said, they came to me, asked me to work in the program, and I said, absolutely not. He goes, LSD is too dangerous to be used on humans. I would never give it to a human, which was a provable lie then, because he had written papers and talked about his own experiments with LSD and people, but not for the CIA. But even that was a lie. And he was never investigated. So he went to his grave threatening to sue anybody who said he had part of it. Nobody ever documented that he was part of it. So what I did was, when I found out he died, I looked up his obituary. They said he retired from UCLA a year before. He was emeritus there. They had named the auditorium after him. So I contacted their special collections department, and I said, he was there for like from 1969 to 98. I said, did he leave his papers with you? And they said, yeah, but they haven't been processed yet. And we've got like 180 boxes. And I said, how long does that take? They said, oh, it could be a couple years. I said, well, I have a magazine assignment and a deadline. And again, somebody probably regretted it. Her name was Charlotte Brown. She was the head of the archives. She said, I don't normally do this, but I can assign some graduate students to start processing the boxes, and we can release maybe a couple boxes a week to you, but you won't get the whole collection for a year. I said, whatever you can release. So then I started going 1 or 2 days a week to look at 1 or 2 boxes. And then at the end of the summer, I found the needle in the haystack. I found letters between West and Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the MK Ultra program, describing the experiments, outlining what West was going to do for the CIA on unwitting people who weren't informed. That's what unwitting means. But even the institutions he was at, first Lackland Air Force Base, University of Oklahoma, the Veterans Hospital, none of them knew that he was doing these secret mind control experiments on patients, prisoners, students. And it showed that he'd lied his entire life about being a part of this program when he was integral to it. He practically wrote the blueprint for it, and I had the letters.
You mentioned Lackland, right?
Yeah.
Is Lackland where the Jimmy Shaver case happened?
Yeah, so Jolly West began at Lackland Air Force Base in around 1951. He was the head psychiatrist there. And during that period, either he had approached the CIA or they approached him. I still don't know who initiated it. But that's when he contracted with them to do MK Ultra research on patients and prisoners and basic airmen at the Air Force Base. And his goal was in the, I think, 12-page letter, the first one I found from June of 1953, to create amnesias, to get people to do stuff against their moral code, to induce trance states, to learn how to induce mental illness in a subject without their knowing. They hit like 13 or 15 goals. And in these letters, he also talked about how he was going to hide it from his supervisors, from the other doctors on the staff. And Gottlieb responds and talks about how our correspondence will be double enveloped. he used the alias Sherman Grifford, and he had a post office box, so the stuff didn't go to the CIA. And then, so West starts doing this research in 52, 53, I think it was. And then July 3rd, 54, this 3-year-old girl disappears in the middle of the night, and then she's found in a gravel pit, raped and murdered. And there's a guy named Jimmy Shaver who was this is weird, but it's 1954. There's a heat wave in Texas where Lackland is, and this family couldn't sleep, so they took their 2 children, what was the little girl's name? Because now I'm friends with her niece and nephew. Sherry Jo Horton. So she's 3 years old. Her parents take her to a bar at like 11 o'clock at night. They go into the bar to drink cold beer, and I guess there's fans. I don't know if they had air conditioning. And Sherry Jo and her brother, who's a year or 2 older, are playing out in the parking lot. Jimmy Shaver's in there with another airman drinking. And then he has to be back at the base by like midnight. So he brings the other airman back and he goes back. And then at some point, the little boy comes running in and says, Sherry's gone after midnight. So they alert the police. They actually alert the Air Force Base. They send out a search party. And at about 4 o'clock in the morning, at a gravel pit, I think a mile away from the bar, this guy comes wandering out of the brush with his shirt off, and he's bleeding from scratch marks all over his torso. And he walks up to these 2 guys who I think were like working at the pit, but they were sleeping in their truck. And he wakes them up and he says, I don't know where I am or how I got here. At the same time, there's these police that come in saying they're searching for the body of a 3-year-old girl who disappeared. They didn't know she was killed. And it turns out they hold him because he looks suspicious. And he says, I don't know anything about a little girl, and I don't know how I got here. Then they search the area, and they find the little girl, and they find Jimmy's car. And the car has her blood on it and her underwear draped over the door. And they said it looked like she'd been attacked by an animal, like her legs were split.
Jesus.
And he was arrested and brought back he was supposed to be brought to the local police, but the Air Force came and said, no, we're taking him into custody. He's one of ours, which still has never been explained to me why they had that authority. So they took him for about 24 hours, and then they released him back to the police. But during the 24 hours, he admitted that he must have abducted and killed this girl, but he had no memory of it. And long story short, Jolly was his attending psychiatrist who testified that he was insane during this crime, that he had voices telling him to go out and kill this cousin that had abused him when he was a child, and he mistook this 3-year-old girl for the cousin Beth Rainbow that abused him, and that he got all of this information from Jimmy by hypnotizing him and giving him sodium pentothal. Long story short, Jimmy got convicted, went to the electric chair 4 years later, was executed, and to his dying day said, I guess I killed her, but I have no recollection of leaving the bar.
Yeah.
So this was at the same time that West was doing these experiments on airmen. It turned out at the trial that he had been suffering from massive migraine headaches since he'd been kicked by a horse as a child. And his mother said that he was in some kind of experimental medical research at Lackland Air Force Base to heal his migraines.
Oh.
West would have been the doctor who did that. West, nobody knew that West had this contract with the CIA to do this stuff, so none of that was ever asked or came out. I think that was an experiment got wrong.
Yeah.
They were trying to see what they could get patients to do, which is what West said he was going to do, and take them to the brink of doing something criminal or something, but not thinking that they're going to kill some poor little girl.
Yeah.
A guy that had no history of violence, never been arrested, father of two children himself, all of a sudden at age 33 goes out and rapes and kills a 3-year-old girl. His daughter is like 2 or 3. I mean, no father would do that unless something
happened. Well, and if this was a mind control program gone wrong and that the intelligence agency was somehow involved in it, I'm curious why he would still get convicted or executed. I mean, is it to maintain the public image of this was just a random killing?
Yeah.
God
damn.
damn.
If you didn't execute him, you'd have to say why you weren't executing him.
Now, you said that Jolly West became famously against the death penalty.
After that, all of a sudden he became an advocate for ending capital punishment. He didn't say it was because of that.
Yeah.
But he had never said anything public about being anti-capital punishment until that. And, a shrink could have a field day with it. Was that his way of making amends for sacrificing this guy's life?
Right.
Who knows?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I could honestly see why it took you 20 years because, man, there's so many names and so many different peripheral situations.
So many tendrils, there's it goes off into...
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, you're doing a good job. It's hard to kind of keep a cohesive conversation.
Well, and to think that JFK and Jack Ruby still is somewhere around here. I mean, but it makes sense though. Like if you're an intelligence agency that's trying to get away with this secret operation, you would inherently make it as confusing as possible and as unbelievable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Dave McGowan's whole point in Program to Kill. His is more on, the side of Satanists and pedophiles.
Yeah.
But, his whole thing is that satanic ritual abuse, which was pretty prevalent in the 80s, was really just a front for intelligence agencies because if anybody had escaped or if anybody did tell the stories of what happened to them, it would be so unbelievable and out of this world that no one would even begin to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it definitely makes sense why it took you so long because I'm sure at some point you're like, shit, I don't even know if I believe this.
I know. And now you're making me question why am I doing the second book and going through all this again?
No, I think the second book is almost necessary because I think, you were kind of limited on the first one, and I would say towards the tail end, it was like, okay, we've got everything.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel like the more books you come out with, the closer we're going to get to this whole smoking gun. And I would imagine if you're writing a second book already,
I'm reporting it. I haven't started writing it. I'm just reporting.
Yeah.
I'm interviewing, getting information. And I should make this clear if this part's going to be in. I haven't committed to it yet because I'm not going to do it unless I get enough finality, unless I can not only, cross my T's and dot my I's, but say yes. And I'm getting close to feeling good about it. I'm meeting with my agent day after tomorrow in Los Angeles when I'm back, and he's expecting me to give him a bullet point list of what I feel confident with and what I don't. I guess I have to do that today or tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also used to me not making deadlines. Yeah. But I mean, it's so fucking hard,
Yeah.
And you have so much self-doubt, and even just reliving it with you here reminds me of the stuff that I still don't feel confident about and stuff I'm reliving the struggle trying to explain to you why something's important.
Well, let me ask you just an opinionated question, because I really do want to know your point on this. My only area of resistance when it comes to this whole theory is knowing who Manson is or thinking I know who Manson is. Wouldn't he want everybody to know?
I don't know if he knows what he knows. I mean, that's another really difficult concept to grasp. So he was at Vacaville in 72, 73. That's a state prison for mentally ill people. He was given lots of drugs. He wrote letters to the judge that he didn't like the drugs. We don't know if they fried his brain. That sounds like a cop-out on my part.
Mm-mm.
I don't think, like I said earlier, in the last 20, not even 20 years, even the 80s, he would say of parole officers, and a lot of this stuff was like cryptic and you couldn't tell why he said it, but he would talk about naval intelligence doctors visiting him when he was at Terminal Island in 1958, 59, which was the place he was released from in 67. He was also held there in the 50s. And other doctors, and he would also say, just arbitrarily out of nowhere, that he had been approached by the federal government to work with him when he was released in 67, which would completely support, my thesis. But I didn't put any of that in the book because I don't trust what comes out of his mouth. I don't know if he understands what he's saying. I've compiled a lot of it now with a little bit more objectivity, I think, because I do want to include it in the second book to see if he was trying to get information out there. But you have to be careful because he would say nonsense. And I have it in my book. He said to me when I was asking too many questions, he goes, "You've got to find the key that Red Skelton hid in the basement beneath." I mean, all this nonsense. And I couldn't tell if that was germane to his thinking or if it was something that he couldn't control. And everybody's seen interviews with him where he does all his crazy hand shit and talking. But then other times he'd be very coherent and make sense. And it's,
I mean, he was inspiring followers long after, like decades after the murders happened.
For better or worse, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is his charisma. I mean, he has it in a strange way. And,
When you spoke to him, did you feel that charisma? I mean...
No. I mean, and again, it was hard because it wasn't face-to-face, and I wanted it to be, but he wasn't allowed to have visitors at the time. But no, I felt like I was talking to a madman.
Yeah.
And when I tried to nail him down and get him to cut the bullshit, he'd get really angry at me. And then I think I have it in the book. At one point, the guy on the outside who handled all of his business, Grey Wolf.
Yeah. AKA Dead Rat.
Yeah. But he would record our conversations on he would be the third party. So Manson's inside, I'm at where I am, and Grey Wolf was actually living right outside the walls of the prison in Hanford.
Pincushion too, right?
Pincushion was inside with Manson, yeah.
I mean, that's a question that I have immediately. Like, how does he maintain this control all these years later? He's got a guy on the inside. He's got a guy on the outside. Like, how does Charles Manson...
It might have just been the notoriety. People want to be attached to notorious figures. I mean, Pincushion, by all accounts, was just a loser. And his name was Pincushion because he got stabbed so many times in prison.
Yeah.
But... yeah, at one point when Grey Wolf was trying to tell me, to make me understand how upset Manson was with me after one of our aborted interviews, he said, "Listen to what the old man said about you on tape." So he played me the tape of when I got off the call and he kept talking to Charlie. And Charlie went from being, rambling and incoherent to talking to Grey Wolf and saying to Grey Wolf, he goes, "Does this O'Neill guy know that he could send me to prison for murders that I didn't commit or I've never been accused of committing? I can't talk to him without a lawyer." And all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, he sounds normal. Why can't I get that?
Wait, Manson was saying this?
He was saying that to Grey Wolf. Like all of a sudden he dropped that facade.
Wow.
So I said, is this whole thing an act? You shouldn't have played me that tape. And then he go, "Oh, well, he has his moments of clarity," which was also true. I did see them sometimes. I could never tell when he was playing and when he wasn't playing.
Yeah. You mentioned like several times throughout the book that Manson kind of acts as a repository for, the fears of Americans. Mm-hmm. And I've always wondered what you meant by that. Like, can you elaborate on that point?
Well, I think that was mostly Bugliosi, who kind of created him as this larger-than-life boogeyman that, anything you're scared of, Manson kind of represents. And my editor, Leslie, said that to me when she gave me the assignment, and I told her I'd never read Helter Skelter. I didn't care about the case. And she goes, "You watch," and this is 1999, "now that I put this idea in your head, I want you to do the story." She goes, "You're going to start noticing in the ether and in pop culture, people reference him all the time. Comedians, serious opinion writers, books. He's a cultural, landmark." And sure enough, I felt like I started hearing his name mentioned by friends or reading in articles. He's kind of like just this moment in time that reverberates through history for so many reasons. And was that because they needed? Well, it's in the book that I do think he served the purpose of, turning society against hippies and the left-wing movement and making them fear them. That was, an objective of COINTELPRO and Chaos.
Well, one of the stronger points, too, is that the Black Panthers were rising pretty prominently in the country throughout that time. And what they found, I think it was at UC Berkeley, that the hippies and the Black Panthers were starting to unite, and that scared the shit out of the government.
Oh yeah. Well, the whites, the anti-war movement was starting to help the Panthers. The Panthers were starting to help them.
Yeah.
And in 1967, when they started Chaos and they started they resumed COINTELPRO. That had been part of the FBI. It was actually created to stop communism first, and then the Klan. And then Hoover supposedly discontinued it at the end of the 50s or early 60s because too much of it, the COINTELPRO agents were committing crimes to set up the people they were investigating to arrest them for crimes. They'd infiltrate them and provoke them. But they resumed it in 67. And at that time, Lyndon Johnson was president, Ronald Reagan was governor of California. And they truly believed that there was about to be a revolution, mostly because of the anti-war movement. Vietnam was escalating, and the Panther movement, the black activism, and the hippies. Everything was kind of having this perfect storm of government, kind of like maybe what we're going through right now. I don't know. I won't get into that.
Man, I don't want to sound too political here, but there's been quite the civil unrest in our country within the last 10 years. Some crazy events, I think January 6th or 7th.
6th.
January 6th. That was a huge event, all the riots that were happening, throughout the United States. And you always hear those rumblings about basically sleeper agents that are mixed in with the crowd who are there to just instigate violence.
Yeah.
And you read a book like yours, and
I know,
it just doesn't seem so far off.
Feeds into that paranoia because it happened,
Well, and it's like paranoia. That's what they want us to feel like it is. Nothing more than that.
Yeah.
You're crazy if you think otherwise. But sometimes when you really dig in deeper, you find that the truth is typically always stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
It is crazy, these age-old sayings. Sometimes they just become so.
There's a
played
reason
out.
that they're age-old sayings. Yeah. They reverberate through time.
Right. So when it
I just love getting lost in this wall.
I know. I've noticed you keep looking at it.
I know. I mean, it's a distraction. I keep wanting to name the movies, and there'll be something I missed that I hadn't seen the first time.
Is there anything that you don't know of?
Oh, there's a lot of stuff I don't recognize. I mean, I see images that I've seen, but I'm not sure what they're from. I'm trying to see, is Manson up there anywhere?
No, I wanted to add real life people on there, but I don't know. It just you start dancing into this territory of like, you don't want to disrespect the
I have to be careful with that too.
Right. So if Vincent Bugliosi was alive today, what would be the one thing you wanted him to respond to the most?
Why did he lie? Why did he tell me what he told me when he told me to turn the recorder off? Was he lying then? Or why would he also tell me that he told those cops to put it back when he knows he couldn't have told them they put it back? I mean, that kills me. I also wanted him to be alive when the book came out because I really wanted him to be held accountable. And a lot of my detractors think that I waited until he died, which pisses me off because I'm like, so you think I chose to live hand to mouth from I think he died in 2016 for 3 more years. And what if he had lived to 2019? You think I would have, you can look at my income tax, my reports. I made nothing. I was fucking broke. I was driving an Uber, teaching English as a second language, doing anything to support my continued reporting. I wanted him to be alive. I wanted him to have to answer real journalist questions like, how do you respond to, this allegation, that allegation? It really upset me, not because I cared about him. I mean, every life is precious, blah, blah, blah. But
there was a piece of you that respected him, though, right? I think it was somewhere in your book you said, although he was an asshole, there was a piece of me that liked that about him.
I might have been more generous then, but sometimes when I think about what he wanted to lie about me to stop me and what he did, I found out worse stuff about him after he died and after my book came out. I don't even know how much I should say. Let me try this out. when he died, after he died, a woman came out and said, I was Vince's mistress for 20 some years. I have a love child with him that he never publicly recognized. So People Magazine did a story, interviewed her. It was picked up by the press. She was going to write a book. I knew about her and her child all the way back to 99. The cops I interviewed told me about it. They said, he had a mistress who he had a baby with. And this is the stuff I want to be careful with because some of the people in his family are alive. Let's just say he was violent with people, not just his mistresses. And I knew about all this, and I never told Vince I knew that he had a love child who's now in her 40s because it wasn't relevant. The mistress that I did write about, I wrote about because he beat her up, and then he made her lie to the police about him beating her up, and then he lied to the police and to the papers. That was relevant, so I wrote about the Virginia Cardwell case in my book. Same thing with the milkman. He lied to the press about the circumstances of why he was stalking the milkman. He libeled that guy, said he thought he had stolen from him. That whole thing was made up to give him a cover for trying to find out whether he fathered his child. That's relevant if I'm saying in my book that he lied about the Manson case, not just in his book, but he had witnesses lie on the stand. And I explained all that to him in my interviews when he tried to get me not to report that stuff. But I didn't write about this mistress. And I didn't ask him about her. I knew it would set him off. And I didn't think anybody, and I know hardly anyone knew about her and this baby's existence. Once the mistress came out after he died and went public, then I met with her. And I said, at that point, it was like 2017. My book was about a year or 2 years away from publication. And I said, you said you were writing a book about this. And I go, are you still doing the book? And she said, I'm not doing the book because my daughter, we got so much horrible hate mail and stuff on social media that my daughter begged me not to write the book. I've made my statement. I stand by it. And I said, I've seen the birth certificate. I've seen the records. I know he's the father of your child. I said, I just want to meet with you and take you to lunch because I'm about to publish a book that presents him in a very negative light. And I want to see, I'm always worried that I'm wrong, that I'm being too difficult, too hard on him. And she said, I'll tell you what the real Vince Bugliosi was like. And I took her to lunch and she told me horror stories about what he did to her. And he's the father of her child. I'm not going to say what it is now because there's still too many people alive that are connected, but it reassured me that he was really a monster. And if I said that in the book, I might have to take that out for another edition. I respected his legal expertise until I found out he cheated and lied in his legal cases. Mm-hmm. Maybe I wrote that I said in the beginning I respected him, but in the end, I think he was really, I've said this probably not in the book, but on podcasts before, I think he was as dangerous as Manson. I don't think he killed anyone that I know of, but he was just as dangerous and just as sociopathic. Jeez. And I'm going to tell you something off the record, if you remind me, when the mics are off, to back that up with one or two little stories that are going to blow your socks off, but I can't talk about them yet.
Hey, but it leaves suspense for the people at home. So
yeah,
I like that. I like the cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, I appreciate you coming into the crypt today. Ladies and gentlemen, please follow Tom on Instagram at Chaos Charles Manson, which I think you should just change to Tom O'Neill.
Oh my God, my nephews told me I had to do that. And I was all set to do it. And then somebody who was teaching me how to do it said I would lose something if I did it. I think any reference that anybody's done on social media and linked to me would all go away.
Yes, that's true.
I don't know if it's important that it's still there, but I was finally persuaded this summer that I should change it to just my name. And then right when I was going to do it, the person who was teaching me how to do it said, you might want to, give this some more thought. So I thought, all right, that's another reason for me just to put it on hold.
Right.
But maybe I will. I don't know.
Well, I love all the extra stuff you post on your Instagram as well. I mean, some of the audio tapes that you're going to hear him, reference in the book are available on your Instagram channel.
Yeah. I also have I put some of the videos that I've made that are also visual on YouTube because people say it's easier to make them big and slow them down and stuff.
Yeah.
So there's also a YouTube channel. I have no idea what it's called, but
Yeah.
I think if you just Google my name, it'll come up.
Well, I will say, I mean, this is like a wormhole squared. I mean, you just keep going into this thing. And when the second one comes out, we're going to do it again. And
If
we're
we're
going to talk
alive,
about all the
yeah.
new evidence.
Yeah.
If we're alive.
I'll come back to the crypt.
Yeah. Well, Tom,
Yeah.
thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
joining me
yeah.
in the crypt,
That's
man.
great.
I really appreciate it. And
Thanks for
everybody at
having
home,
me.
peace.
Bye-bye.